Chapter 10. Does it ever happen to you, said Natasha to her brother, when they settled down in the sitting room, does it ever happen to you to feel as if there were nothing more to come, nothing, that everything good is past? And to feel not exactly dull, but sad? I should think so, he replied. I have felt like that when everything was all right, and everyone was cheerful. The thought has come into my mind that I was already tired of it all, and that we must all die. Once in the regiment, I had not gone to some merrymaking where there was music. And suddenly, I felt so depressed. Oh yes, I know, Natasha interrupted him. When I was quite little, that used to be so with me. Do you remember when I was punished once about some plums? You were all dancing, and I sat sobbing in the schoolroom. I shall never forget it. I felt sad and sorry for everyone, for myself, and for everyone. And I was innocent, that was the chief thing, said Natasha. Do you remember? I remember, answered Nicholas. I remember that I came to you afterwards and wanted to comfort you, but do you know, I felt ashamed too. We were terribly absurd. I had a funny doll then and wanted to give it to you. Do you remember? And do you remember, Natasha asked with a pensive smile, how once long ago, when we were quite little, Uncle called us into the study that was in the old house, and it was dark. We went in and suddenly there stood a Negro, chimed in Nicholas with a smile of delight. Of course I remember. Even now, I don't know whether there really was a Negro, or if we only dreamed it or were told about him. He was gray, you remember, and had white teeth, and stood and looked at us. Sonia, do you remember? Asked Nicholas. Yes, I do remember something too, Sonia answered timidly. You know, I have asked Papa and Mama about that Negro, said Natasha, and they say there was no Negro at all. But you see, you remember. Of course I do. I remember his teeth as if I had just seen them. How strange it is. It's as if it were a dream. I like that. And do you remember how we rolled hard-boiled eggs in the ballroom, and suddenly 2 old women began spinning round on the carpet? Was that real or not? Do you remember what fun it was? Yes, and you remember how Papa in his blue overcoat fired a gun in the porch. So they went through their memories, smiling with pleasure. Not the sad memories of old age, but poetic, youthful ones, those impressions of one's most distant past in which dreams and realities blend, and they laughed with quiet enjoyment. Sonia, as always, did not quite keep pace with them, though they shared the same reminiscences. Much that they remembered had slipped from her mind, and what she recalled did not arouse the same poetic feeling as they experienced. She simply enjoyed their pleasure and tried to fit in with it. She only really took part when they recalled Sonia's first arrival. She told them how afraid she had been of Nicholas because he had on a corded jacket, and her nurse had told her that she, too, would be sewn up with cords. And I remember their telling me that you had been born under a cabbage, said Natasha, and I remember that I dared not disbelieve it then, but knew that it was not true, and I felt so uncomfortable. While they were talking, a maid thrust her head in at the other door of the sitting room. They have brought the cock, miss, she said in a whisper. It isn't wanted, Polya. Tell them to take it away, replied Natasha. In the middle of their talk in the sitting room, Dimmler came in and went up to the harp that stood there in a corner. He took off its cloth covering, and the harp gave out a jarring sound. Mr. Dimmler, please play my favorite nocturne by Field, came the old countess' voice from the drawing room. Dimmler struck a chord and, turning to Natasha, Nicholas, and Sonia, remarked, How quiet you young people are. Yes, we're philosophizing, said Natasha, glancing round for a moment and then continuing the conversation. They were now discussing dreams. Dimmler began to play. Natasha went on tiptoe noiselessly to the table, took up a candle, carried it out, and returned, seating herself quietly in her former place. It was dark in the room, especially where they were sitting on the sofa, but through the big windows, the silvery light of the full moon fell on the floor. Dimmler had finished the piece, but still sat softly running his fingers over the strings, evidently uncertain whether to stop or to play something else. Do you know, said Natasha in a whisper, moving closer to Nicholas and Sonia, that when one goes on and on recalling memories, one at last begins to remember what happened before one was in the world. That is metempsychosis, said Sonia, who had always learned well and remembered everything. The Egyptians believed that our souls have lived in animals and will go back into animals again. No, I don't believe we ever were in animals, said Natasha, still in a whisper though the music had ceased. But I am certain that we were angels somewhere there and have been here, and that is why we remember. May I join you? Said Dimmler, who had come up quietly, and he sat down by them. If we have been angels, why have we fallen lower? Said Nicholas. No, that can't be. Not lower, who said we were lower? How do I know what I was before? Natasha rejoined with conviction. The soul is immortal. Well then, if I shall always live, I must have lived before, lived for a whole eternity. Yes, but it is hard for us to imagine eternity, remarked Dimmler, who had joined the young folk with a mildly condescending smile, but now spoke as quietly and seriously as they. Why is it hard to imagine eternity? Said Natasha. It is now today, and it will be tomorrow and always, and there was yesterday and the day before. Natasha. Now it's your turn. Sing me something, they heard the Countess say. Why are you sitting there like conspirators? Mama, I don't at all want to, replied Natasha, but all the same she rose. None of them, not even the middle-aged Dimmler, wanted to break off their conversation and quit that corner in the sitting room, but Natasha got up and Nicholas sat down at the clavichord. Standing as usual in the middle of the hall and choosing the place where the resonance was best, Natasha began to sing her mother's favorite song. She had said she did not want to sing, but it was long since she had sung, and long before she again sang, as she did that evening. The Count, from his study where he was talking to Meitinka, heard her, and like a schoolboy in a hurry to run out to play, blundered in his talk while giving orders to the steward, and at last stopped, while Meitinka stood in front of him also listening and smiling. Nicholas did not take his eyes off his sister, and drew breath in time with her. Sonia, as she listened, thought of the immense difference there was between herself and her friend, and how impossible it was for her to be anything like as bewitching as her cousin. The old countess sat with a blissful yet sad smile, and with tears in her eyes, occasionally shaking her head. She thought of Natasha and of her own youth, and of how there was something unnatural and dreadful in this impending marriage of Natasha and Prince Andrew. Dimmler, who had seated himself beside the countess, listened with closed eyes. Ah, Countess, he said at last, that's a European talent she has nothing to learn, what softness, tenderness, and strength. Ah, how afraid I am for her, how afraid I am, said the countess, not realizing to whom she was speaking. Her maternal instinct told her that Natasha had too much of something, and that because of this she would not be happy. Before Natasha had finished singing, 14-year-old Petya rushed in delightedly to say that some mummers had arrived. Natasha stopped abruptly. Idiot, she screamed at her brother and, running to a chair, threw herself on it, sobbing so violently that she could not stop for a long time. It's nothing, Mama, really it's nothing. Only Petya startled me, she said, trying to smile, but her tears still flowed and sobs still choked her. The mummers, some of the house serfs, dressed up as bears, Turks, innkeepers, and ladies, frightening and funny, bringing in with them the cold from outside and a feeling of gaiety, crowded at first timidly into the anteroom. Then hiding behind one another they pushed into the ballroom where, shyly at first and then more and more merrily and heartily, they started singing, dancing, and playing Christmas games. The countess, when she had identified them and laughed at their costumes, went into the drawing room. The count sat in the ballroom, smiling radiantly and applauding the players. The young people had disappeared. Half an hour later there appeared among the other mummers in the ballroom an old lady in a whooped skirt. This was Nicholas. A Turkish girl was Petya. A clown was Dimmler. An hussar was Natasha, and a Circassian was Sonia with burnt cork mustache and eyebrows. After the condescending surprise, non-recognition, and praise from those who were not themselves dressed up, the young people decided that their costumes were so good that they ought to be shown elsewhere. Nicholas, who, as the roads were in splendid condition, wanted to take them all for a drive in his troika, proposed to take with them about a dozen of the serf mummers and drive to Uncle S. No, why disturb the old fellow, said the countess. Besides, you wouldn't have room to turn round there. If you must go, go to the Melyukovs. Melyukova was a widow, who, with her family and their tutors and governesses, lived 3 miles from the Rostovs. That's right, my dear, chimed in the old count, thoroughly aroused. I'll dress up at once and go with them. I'll make Pashette open her eyes. But the countess would not agree to his going. He had had a bad leg all these last days. It was decided that the count must not go, but that if Luisa Ivanovna, Madame Skoss, would go with them, the young ladies might go to the Melyukovs. Sonia, generally so timid and shy, more urgently than anyone begging Luisa Ivanovna not to refuse. Sonia's costume was the best of all. Her mustache and eyebrows were extraordinarily becoming. Everyone told her she looked very handsome, and she was in a spirited and energetic mood unusual with her. Some inner voice told her that now or never her fate would be decided, and in her male attire she seemed quite a different person. Luisa Ivanovna consented to go, and in half an hour 4 troika sleighs with large and small bells, their runners squeaking and whistling over the frozen snow, drove up to the porch. Natasha was foremost in setting a merry holiday tone, which, passing from one to another, grew stronger and reached its climax when they all came out into the frost and got into the sleighs, talking, calling to one another, laughing and shouting. 2 of the troikas were the usual household sleighs, the third was the old Count S with a trotter from the Orlov stud as shaft horse. The fourth was Nicholas, own with a short, shaggy black shaft horse. Nicholas, in his old lady's dress over which he had belted his hussar overcoat, stood in the middle of the sleigh, reins in hand. It was so light that he could see the moonlight reflected from the metal harness discs and from the eyes of the horses, who looked round in alarm at the noisy party under the shadow of the porch roof. Natasha, Sonia, Madame Skoss, and 2 maids got into Nicholas' sleigh. Dimmler, his wife, and Petya into the old Count S, and the rest of the mummers seated themselves in the other 2 sleighs. "You go ahead, Zakhar," shouted Nicholas to his father's coachman, wishing for a chance to race past him. The old Count's troika, with Dimmler and his party, started forward, squeaking on its runners as though freezing to the snow, its deep-toned bell clanging. The side horses, pressing against the shafts of the middle horse, sank in the snow, which was dry and glittered like sugar, and threw it up. Nicholas set off, following the first sleigh. Behind him the others moved noisily, their runners squeaking. At first they drove at a steady trot along the narrow road. While they drove past the garden, the shadows of the bare trees often fell across the road and hid the brilliant moonlight. But as soon as they were past the fence, the snowy plain bathed in moonlight and motionless spread out before them, glittering like diamonds and dappled with bluish shadows. Bangs, bang! Went the first sleigh over a cradle hole in the snow of the road, and each of the other sleighs jolted in the same way, and rudely breaking the frost-bound stillness, the troikas began to speed along the road, one after the other. "A hair's track, a lot of tracks," rang out Natasha's voice through the frost-bound air. "How light it is, Nicholas," came Sonia's voice. Nicholas glanced round at Sonia and bent down to see her face closer. Quite a new, sweet face with black eyebrows and mustaches peeped up at him from her sable furs, so close and yet so distant in the moonlight. That used to be Sonia, thought he, and looked at her closer and smiled. "What is it, Nicholas?" "Nothing," said he, and turned again to the horses. When they came out onto the beaten highroad, polished by sleigh runners and cut up by roughshod hoofs, the marks of which were visible in the moonlight, the horses began to tug at the reins of their own accord and increased their pace. The near side horse, arching his head and breaking into a short canter, tugged at his traces. The shaft horse swayed from side to side, moving his ears as if asking, "Isn't it time to begin now?" In front, already far ahead, the deep bell of the sleigh ringing farther and farther off, the black horses driven by Zakhar could be clearly seen against the white snow. From that sleigh one could hear the shouts, laughter, and voices of the mummers. "Gee up, my darlings," shouted Nicholas, pulling the reins to one side and flourishing the whip. It was only by the keener wind that met them and the jerks given by the side horses who pulled harder, ever increasing their gallop, that one noticed how fast the troika was flying. Nicholas looked back. With screams, squeals, and waving of whips that caused even the shaft horses to gallop, the other sleighs followed. The shaft horse swung steadily beneath the bow over its head, with no thought of slackening pace and ready to put on speed when required. Nicholas overtook the first sleigh. They were driving downhill and coming out upon a broad trodden track across a meadow, near a river. "Where are we?" thought he. "It's the Kasi meadow, I suppose. But no, this is something new I've never seen before. This isn't the Kasi meadow nor the Demkin Hill, and heaven only knows what it is. It is something new and enchanted. Well, whatever it may be," and shouting to his horses, he began to pass the first sleigh. Zakhar held back his horses and turned his face, which was already covered with hoarfrost, to his eyebrows. Nicholas gave the horses the rein, and Zakhar, stretching out his arms, clucked his tongue and let his horses go. "Now look out, master," he cried. Faster still the two troikas flew side by side, and faster moved the feet of the galloping side horses. Nicholas began to draw ahead. Zakhar, while still keeping his arms extended, raised one hand with the reins. "No, you won't, master," he shouted. Nicholas put all his horses to a gallop and passed Zakhar. The horses showered the fine dry snow on the faces of those in the sleigh. Beside them sounded quick ringing bells, and they caught confused glimpses of swiftly moving legs and the shadows of the troika they were passing. The whistling sound of the runners on the snow and the voices of girls shrieking were heard from different sides. Again checking his horses, Nicholas looked around him. They were still surrounded by the magic plain, bathed in moonlight and spangled with stars. "Zakhar is shouting that I should turn to the left, but why to the left?" thought Nicholas. "Are we getting to the Melyukovs? Is this Melyukovka? Heaven only knows where we are going, and heaven knows what is happening to us, but it is very strange and pleasant whatever it is." And he looked round in the sleigh. "Look, his mustache and eyelashes are all white," said one of the strange, pretty, unfamiliar people, the one with fine eyebrows and mustache. "I think this used to be Natasha," thought Nicholas, "and that was Madame Skoss, but perhaps it's not, and this Circassian with the mustache I don't know, but I love her." "Aren't you cold?" he asked. They did not answer, but began to laugh. Dimmler from the sleigh behind shouted something, probably something funny, but they could not make out what he said. "Yes, yes," some voices answered, laughing. But here was a fairy forest with black moving shadows, and a glitter of diamonds and a flight of marble steps, and the silver roofs of fairy buildings, and the shrill yells of some animals. And if this is really Melyukovka, it is still stranger that we drove heaven knows where and have come to Melyukovka, thought Nicholas. It really was Melyukovka, and maids and footmen with merry faces came running out to the porch carrying candles. "Who is it?" asked someone in the porch. "The mummers from the Count S." "I know by the horses," replied some voices. Chapter 11. Pelagia Danilovna Melyukova, a broadly built, energetic woman wearing spectacles, sat in the drawing room in a loose dress, surrounded by her daughters whom she was trying to keep from feeling dull. They were quietly dropping melted wax into snow and looking at the shadows the wax figures would throw on the wall, when they heard the steps and voices of new arrivals in the vestibule. Hussars, ladies, witches, clowns, and bears, after clearing their throats and wiping the hoarfrost from their faces in the vestibule, came into the ballroom where candles were hurriedly lighted. The clown Dimmler and the lady Nicholas started a dance. Surrounded by the screaming children, the mummers, covering their faces and disguising their voices, bowed to their hostess and arranged themselves about the room. "Dear me, there's no recognizing them. And Natasha, see whom she looks like. She really reminds me of somebody. But Herr Dimmler, isn't he good? I didn't know him. And how he dances. Dear me, there's a Circassian. Really, how becoming it is to dear Sonia. And who is that? Well, you have cheered us up. Nikita and Vanya, clear away the tables. And we were sitting so quietly. Hot. The hussar. Just like a boy. And the legs. I can't look at him," different voices were saying. Natasha, the young Melyukov's favorite, disappeared with them into the back rooms where a cork and various dressing gowns and male garments were called for, and received from the footman by bare girlish arms from behind the door. 10 minutes later, all the young Melyukovs joined the mummers. Pelagia Danilovna, having given orders to clear the rooms for the visitors and arranged about refreshments for the gentry and the serfs, went about among the mummers without removing her spectacles, peering into their faces with a suppressed smile and failing to recognize any of them. It was not merely Dimmler and the Rostovs she failed to recognize, she did not even recognize her own daughters or her late husband, dressing gowns and uniforms which they had put on. "And who is this?" she asked her governess, peering into the face of her own daughter dressed up as a Kazan Tartar. "I suppose it is one of the Rostovs." "Well, Mr. Hussar, and what regiment do you serve in?" she asked Natasha. "Here, hand some fruit jelly to the Turk," she ordered the butler who was handing things round. "That's not forbidden by his law." Sometimes, as she looked at the strange but amusing capers cut by the dancers, who, having decided once for all that being disguised, no one would recognize them, were not at all shy, Pelagia Danilovna hid her face in her handkerchief, and her whole stout body shook with irrepressible, kindly, elderly laughter. "My little Sasha. Look at Sasha," she said. After Russian country dances and chorus dances, Pelagia Danilovna made the serfs and gentry join in one large circle. A ring, a string, and a silver ruble were fetched, and they all played games together. In an hour, all the costumes were crumpled and disordered. The corked eyebrows and mustaches were smeared over the perspiring, flushed, and merry faces. Pelagia Danilovna began to recognize the mummers, admired their cleverly contrived costumes, and particularly how they suited the young ladies, and she thanked them all for having entertained her so well. The visitors were invited to supper in the drawing room, and the serfs had something served to them in the ballroom. "Now to tell one's fortune in the empty bathhouse is frightening," said an old maid who lived with the Melyukovs during supper. "Why," said the eldest Melyukov girl. "You wouldn't go, it takes courage." "I'll go," said Sonya. "Tell what happened to the young lady," said the second Melyukov girl. "Well," began the old maid, "a young lady once went out, took a cock, laid the table for two all properly, and sat down. After sitting a while, she suddenly hears someone coming. A sleigh drives up with harness bells, she hears him coming. He comes in, just in the shape of a man, like an officer, comes in and sits down to table with her." "Ah, screamed Natasha, rolling her eyes with horror. "Yes." "And how? Did he speak?" "Yes, like a man. Everything quite all right, and he began persuading her. And she should have kept him talking till cockcrow, but she got frightened and hid her face in her hands. Then he caught her up. It was lucky the maids ran in just then." "Now why frighten them?" said Pelagia Danilovna. "Mamma, you used to try your fate yourself," said her daughter. "And how does one do it in a barn?" inquired Sonya. "Well, say you went to the barn now, and listened. It depends on what you hear. Hammering and knocking, that's bad. But a sound of shifting grain is good, and one sometimes hears that too. Mamma, tell us what happened to you in the barn." Pelagia Danilovna smiled. "Oh, I've forgotten," she replied. "But none of you would go." "Yes, I will, Pelagia Danilovna, let me." "I'll go," said Sonya. "Well, why not if you're not afraid?" "Luisa Ivanovna, may I?" asked Sonya. Whether they were playing the ring and string game or the ruble game or talking as now, Nicholas did not leave Sonya's side, and gazed at her with quite new eyes. It seemed to him that it was only today, thanks to that burnt cork mustache, that he had fully learned to know her. And really, that evening, Sonya was brighter, more animated, and prettier than Nicholas had ever seen her before. "So that's what she is like. What a fool I have been," he thought, gazing at her sparkling eyes, and under the mustache a happy, rapturous smile dimpled her cheeks, a smile he had never seen before. "I'm not afraid of anything," said Sonya. "May I go at once?" She got up. They told her where the barn was and how she should stand and listen, and they handed her a fur cloak. She threw this over her head and shoulders and glanced at Nicholas. "What a darling that girl is," thought he. "And what have I been thinking of till now?" Sonya went out into the passage to go to the barn. Nicholas went hastily to the front porch, saying he felt too hot. The crowd of people really had made the house stuffy. Outside, there was the same cold stillness and the same moon, but even brighter than before. The light was so strong, and the snow sparkled with so many stars that one did not wish to look up at the sky, and the real stars were unnoticed. The sky was black and dreary, while the earth was gay. "I am a fool, a fool. What have I been waiting for?" thought Nicholas, and running out from the porch he went round the corner of the house and along the path that led to the back porch. He knew Sonia would pass that way. Halfway lay some snow-covered piles of firewood and a cross, and along them a network of shadows from the bare old lime trees fell on the snow and on the path. This path led to the barn. The log walls of the barn and its snow-covered roof, that looked as if hewn out of some precious stone, sparkled in the moonlight. A tree in the garden snapped with the frost, and then all was again perfectly silent. His bosom seemed to inhale not air, but the strength of eternal youth and gladness. From the back porch came the sound of feet descending the steps. The bottom step upon which snow had fallen gave a ringing creak, and he heard the voice of an old maidservant saying, "Straight, straight, along the path, miss. Only don't look back." "I am not afraid," answered Sonia's voice, and along the path toward Nicholas came the crunching, whistling sound of Sonia's feet in her thin shoes. Sonia came along, wrapped in her cloak. She was only a couple of paces away when she saw him, and to her, too, he was not the Nicholas she had known and always slightly feared. He was in a woman's dress, with tousled hair and a happy smile new to Sonia. She ran rapidly toward him. Quite different and yet the same, thought Nicholas, looking at her face all lit up by the moonlight. He slipped his arms under the cloak that covered her head, embraced her, pressed her to him, and kissed her on the lips that wore a mustache and had a smell of burnt cork. Sonia kissed him full on the lips, and disengaging her little hands pressed them to his cheeks. "Sonia, Nicholas," was all they said. They ran to the barn and then back again, re-entering, he by the front and she by the back porch. Chapter 12. When they all drove back from Pelagia Danilovna's, Natasha, who always saw and noticed everything, arranged that she and Madame Skoss should go back in the sleigh with Dimmler, and Sonia with Nicholas and the maids. On the way back, Nicholas drove at a steady pace, instead of racing, and kept peering by that fantastic all-transforming light into Sonia's face, and searching beneath the eyebrows and mustache for his former and his present Sonia, from whom he had resolved never to be parted again. He looked and recognizing in her both the old and the new Sonia, and being reminded by the smell of burnt cork of the sensation of her kiss, inhaled the frosty air with a full breast, and looking at the ground flying beneath him and at the sparkling sky, felt himself again in fairyland. "Sonia, is it well with thee?" he asked from time to time. "Yes," she replied. "And with thee?" When halfway home, Nicholas handed the reins to the coachman and ran for a moment to Natasha's sleigh and stood on its wing. "Natasha," he whispered in French, "do you know I have made up my mind about Sonia?" "Have you told her?" asked Natasha, suddenly beaming all over with joy. "Oh, how strange you are with that mustache and those eyebrows. Natasha, are you glad?" "I am so glad, so glad. I was beginning to be vexed with you. I did not tell you, but you have been treating her badly. What a heart she has, Nicholas. I am horrid sometimes, but I was ashamed to be happy while Sonia was not," continued Natasha. "Now I am so glad. Well, run back to her." "No, wait a bit." "Oh, how funny you look," cried Nicholas, peering into her face and finding in his sister too something new, unusual, and bewitchingly tender that he had not seen in her before. "Natasha, it's magical, isn't it?" "Yes," she replied. "You have done splendidly." Had I seen her before as she is now, thought Nicholas, I should long ago have asked her what to do and have done whatever she told me, and all would have been well. So you are glad and I have done right. Oh, quite right. I had a quarrel with Mama some time ago about it. Mama said she was angling for you. How could she say such a thing? I nearly stormed at Mama. I will never let anyone say anything bad of Sonia, for there is nothing but good in her. Then it's all right, said Nicholas, again scrutinizing the expression of his sister's face to see if she was in earnest. Then he jumped down and, his boots scrunching the snow, ran back to his sleigh. The same happy, smiling Circassian, with mustache and beaming eyes looking up from under a sable hood, was still sitting there, and that Circassian was Sonia. And that Sonia was certainly his future happy and loving wife. When they reached home and had told their mother how they had spent the evening at the Melyukovs, the girls went to their bedroom. When they had undressed, but without washing off the cork mustaches, they sat a long time talking of their happiness. They talked of how they would live when they were married, how their husbands would be friends, and how happy they would be. On Natasha's table stood 2 looking glasses, which Dunyasha had prepared beforehand. "Only when will all that be?" "I am afraid never." "It would be too good," said Natasha, rising and going to the looking glasses. "Sit down, Natasha, perhaps you'll see him," said Sonia. Natasha lit the candles, one on each side of one of the looking glasses, and sat down. "I see someone with a mustache," said Natasha, seeing her own face. "You mustn't laugh, miss," said Dunyasha. With Sonia's help and the maid, Natasha got the glass she held into the right position opposite the other. Her face assumed a serious expression, and she sat silent. She sat a long time looking at the receding line of candles reflected in the glasses and expecting, from tales she had heard, to see a coffin, or him, Prince Andrew, in that last dim, indistinctly outlined square. But ready as she was to take the smallest speck for the image of a man or of a coffin, she saw nothing. She began blinking rapidly and moved away from the looking glasses. "Why is it others see things and I do?" she said. "You sit down now, Sonia. You absolutely must tonight. Do it for me. Today I feel so frightened." Sonia sat down before the glasses, got the right position, and began looking. "Now Miss Sonia is sure to see something," whispered Dunyasha, "while you do nothing but laugh." Sonia heard this and Natasha's whisper. "I know she will. She saw something last year." For about 3 minutes all were silent. "Of course she will," whispered Natasha, but did not finish. Suddenly, Sonia pushed away the glass she was holding and covered her eyes with her hand. "Oh, Natasha," she cried. "Did you say? Did you?" "What was it?" exclaimed Natasha, holding up the looking glass. Sonia had not seen anything. She was just wanting to blink and to get up when she heard Natasha say, "Of course she will." She did not wish to disappoint either Dunyasha or Natasha, but it was hard to sit still. She did not herself know how, or why the exclamation escaped her when she covered her eyes. "You saw him," urged Natasha, seizing her hand. "Yes." "Wait a bit." "I saw him," Sonia could not help saying, not yet knowing whom Natasha meant by him, Nicholas or Prince Andrew. "But why shouldn't I say I saw something? Others do see. Besides, who can tell whether I saw anything or not?" flashed through Sonia's mind. "Yes, I saw him," she said. "How? Standing or lying?" "No, I saw. At first there was nothing, then I saw him lying down." "Andrew lying. Is he ill?" asked Natasha, her frightened eyes fixed on her friend. "No, on the contrary, on the contrary. His face was cheerful, and he turned to me." And when saying this, she herself fancied she had really seen what she described. "Well, and then, Sonia?" "After that, I could not make out what there was, something blue and red." "Sonia, when will he come back? When shall I see him? Oh God, how afraid I am for him and for myself and about everything," Natasha began, and without replying to Sonia's words of comfort, she got into bed, and long after her candle was out lay open-eyed and motionless, gazing at the moonlight through the frosty window panes. Chapter 13. Soon after the Christmas holidays, Nicholas told his mother of his love for Sonia and of his firm resolve to marry her. The Countess, who had long noticed what was going on between them and was expecting this declaration, listened to him in silence and then told her son that he might marry whom he pleased, but that neither she nor his father would give their blessing to such a marriage. Nicholas, for the first time, felt that his mother was displeased with him, and that, despite her love for him, she would not give way. Coldly, without looking at her son, she sent for her husband, and when he came, tried briefly and coldly to inform him of the facts, in her son's presence, but unable to restrain herself, she burst into tears of vexation and left the room. The old count began irresolutely to admonish Nicholas and beg him to abandon his purpose. Nicholas replied that he could not go back on his word, and his father, sighing and evidently disconcerted, very soon became silent and went in to the countess. In all his encounters with his son, the count was always conscious of his own guilt toward him for having wasted the family fortune, and so he could not be angry with him for refusing to marry an heiress and choosing the dowerless Sonia. On this occasion, he was only more vividly conscious of the fact that if his affairs had not been in disorder, no better wife for Nicholas than Sonia could have been wished for, and that no one but himself with his maidenka and his uncomfortable habits was to blame for the condition of the family finances. The father and mother did not speak of the matter to their son again, but a few days later the countess sent for Sonia and, with a cruelty neither of them expected, reproached her niece for trying to catch Nicholas and for ingratitude. Sonia listened silently with downcast eyes to the countess' cruel words, without understanding what was required of her. She was ready to sacrifice everything for her benefactors. Self-sacrifice was her most cherished idea, but in this case she could not see what she ought to sacrifice or for whom. She could not help loving the countess and the whole Rostov family, but neither could she help loving Nicholas and knowing that his happiness depended on that love. She was silent and sad and did not reply. Nicholas felt the situation to be intolerable and went to have an explanation with his mother. He first implored her to forgive him and Sonia and consent to their marriage. Then he threatened that if she molested Sonia, he would at once marry her secretly. The countess, with a coldness her son had never seen in her before, replied that he was of age, that Prince Andrew was marrying without his father's consent, and he could do the same, but that she would never receive that intriguer as her daughter. Exploding at the word intriguer, Nicholas, raising his voice, told his mother he had never expected her to try to force him to sell his feelings, but if that were so, he would say for the last time. But he had no time to utter the decisive word, which the expression of his face caused his mother to await with terror, and which would perhaps have forever remained a cruel memory to them both. He had not time to say it, for Natasha, with a pale and set face, entered the room from the door at which she had been listening. "Nicholas, you are talking nonsense." Be quiet, I tell you," she almost screamed so as to drown his voice. "Mamma darling, it's not at all so." "My poor, sweet darling," she said to her mother, who, conscious that they had been on the brink of a rupture, gazed at her son with terror, but in the obstinacy and excitement of the conflict could not and would not give way. "Nicholas, I'll explain to you." "Go away." "Listen, Mamma darling," said Natasha. Her words were incoherent, but they attained the purpose at which she was aiming. The countess, sobbing heavily, hid her face on her daughter's breast, while Nicholas rose, clutching his head, and left the room. Natasha set to work to effect a reconciliation, and so far succeeded that Nicholas received a promise from his mother that Sonia should not be troubled, while he on his side promised not to undertake anything without his parents' knowledge. Firmly resolved, after putting his affairs in order in the regiment, to retire from the army and return and marry Sonia, Nicholas, serious, sorrowful, and at variance with his parents, but as it seemed to him, passionately in love, left at the beginning of January to rejoin his regiment. After Nicholas had gone, things in the Rostov household were more depressing than ever, and the countess fell ill from mental agitation. Sonia was unhappy at the separation from Nicholas, and still more so on account of the hostile tone the countess could not help adopting toward her. The count was more perturbed than ever by the condition of his affairs, which called for some decisive action. Their town house and estate near Moscow had inevitably to be sold, and for this they had to go to Moscow. But the countess' health obliged them to delay their departure from day to day. Natasha, who had borne the first period of separation from her betrothed lightly and even cheerfully, now grew more agitated and impatient every day. The thought that her best days, which she would have employed in loving him, were being vainly wasted, with no advantage to anyone, tormented her incessantly. His letters for the most part irritated her. It hurt her to think that while she lived only in the thought of him, he was living a real life, seeing new places and new people that interested him. The more interesting his letters were, the more vexed she felt. Her letters to him, far from giving her any comfort, seemed to her a wearisome and artificial obligation. She could not write, because she could not conceive the possibility of expressing sincerely in a letter even 1,000th part of what she expressed by voice, smile, and glance. She wrote to him formal, monotonous, and dry letters, to which she attached no importance herself, and in the rough copies of which the Countess corrected her mistakes in spelling. There was still no improvement in the Countess' health, but it was impossible to defer the journey to Moscow any longer. Natasha's trousseau had to be ordered and the house sold. Moreover, Prince Andrew was expected in Moscow, where old Prince Bolkonsky was spending the winter, and Natasha felt sure he had already arrived. So the Countess remained in the country, and the Count, taking Sonia and Natasha with him, went to Moscow at the end of January. Book 8, 1811-12. Chapter 1. After Prince Andrew's engagement to Natasha, Pierre, without any apparent cause, suddenly felt it impossible to go on living as before. Firmly convinced, as he was of the truths revealed to him by his benefactor, and happy as he had been in perfecting his inner man, to which he had devoted himself with such ardor, all the zest of such a life vanished after the engagement of Andrew and Natasha and the death of Joseph Alexievich, the news of which reached him almost at the same time. Only the skeleton of life remained. His house, a brilliant wife who now enjoyed the favors of a very important personage, acquaintance with all Petersburg, and his court service with its dull formalities. And this life suddenly seemed to Pierre unexpectedly loathsome. He ceased keeping a diary, avoided the company of the brothers, began going to the club again, drank a great deal, and came once more in touch with the bachelor sets, leading such a life that the Countess Helene thought it necessary to speak severely to him about it. Pierre felt that she was right, and to avoid compromising her went away to Moscow. In Moscow, as soon as he entered his huge house in which the faded and fading princesses still lived, with its enormous retinue. As soon as, driving through the town, he saw the Iberian shrine with innumerable tapers burning before the golden covers of the icons, the Kremlin square with its snow undisturbed by vehicles, the sleigh drivers and hovels of the Sivtsev Vrajak, those old Muscovites who desired nothing, hurried nowhere, and were ending their days leisurely. When he saw those old Moscow ladies, the Moscow balls, and the English club, he felt himself at home in a quiet haven. In Moscow he felt at peace, at home, warm and dirty as in an old dressing gown. Moscow society, from the old women down to the children, received Pierre like a long-expected guest whose place was always ready awaiting him. For Moscow society, Pierre was the nicest, kindest, most intellectual, merriest, and most magnanimous of cranks, a heedless, genial nobleman of the old Russian type. His purse was always empty because it was open to everyone. Benefit performances, poor pictures, statues, benevolent societies, gypsy choirs, schools, subscription dinners, sprees, Freemasons, churches, and books. No one and nothing met with a refusal from him, and had it not been for two friends who had borrowed large sums from him and taken him under their protection, he would have given everything away. There was never a dinner or soirée at the club without him. As soon as he sank into his place on the sofa, after 2 bottles of Margox, he was surrounded, and talking, disputing, and joking began. When there were quarrels, his kindly smile and well-timed jests reconciled the antagonists. The Masonic dinners were dull and dreary when he was not there. When after a bachelor supper, he rose with his amiable and kindly smile, yielding to the entreaties of the festive company to drive off somewhere with them, shouts of delight and triumph arose among the young men. At balls he danced if a partner was needed. Young ladies, married and unmarried, liked him because without making love to any of them, he was equally amiable to all, especially after supper. Il est charmant, il n'a pas de sexe, they said of him. He is charming, he has no sex. Pierre was one of those retired gentlemen-in-waiting, of whom there were hundreds good-humoredly, ending their days in Moscow. How horrified he would have been 7 years before, when he first arrived from abroad, had he been told that there was no need for him to seek or plan anything, that his rut had long been shaped, eternally predetermined, and that, wriggle as he might, he would be what all in his position were. He could not have believed it. Had he not at one time longed with all his heart to establish a republic in Russia, then himself to be a Napoleon, then to be a philosopher, and then a strategist and the conqueror of Napoleon? Had he not seen the possibility of, and passionately desired, the regeneration of the sinful human race, and his own progress to the highest degree of perfection? Had he not established schools and hospitals and liberated his serfs? But instead of all that, here he was, the wealthy husband of an unfaithful wife, a retired gentleman-in-waiting, fond of eating and drinking, and, as he unbuttoned his waistcoat, of abusing the government a bit, a member of the Moscow English Club and a universal favorite in Moscow society. For a long time, he could not reconcile himself to the idea that he was one of those same retired Moscow gentlemen-in-waiting he had so despised 7 years before. Sometimes he consoled himself with the thought that he was only living this life temporarily. But then he was shocked by the thought of how many, like himself, had entered that life and that club temporarily with all their teeth and hair, and had only left it when not a single tooth or hair remained. In moments of pride, when he thought of his position, it seemed to him that he was quite different and distinct from those other retired gentlemen-in-waiting he had formerly despised. They were empty, stupid, contented fellows, satisfied with their position, while I am still discontented and want to do something for mankind. But perhaps all these comrades of mine struggled just like me and sought something new, a path in life of their own, and like me were brought by force of circumstances, society, and race, by that elemental force against which man is powerless, to the condition I am in, said he to himself in moments of humility. And after living some time in Moscow, he no longer despised, but began to grow fond of, to respect, and to pity his comrades in destiny as he pitied himself. Pierre no longer suffered moments of despair, hypochondria, and disgust with life. But the malady that had formerly found expression in such acute attacks was driven inwards and never left him for a moment. What for? Why? What is going on in the world? He would ask himself in perplexity several times a day, involuntarily beginning to reflect anew on the meaning of the phenomena of life. But knowing by experience that there were no answers to these questions, he made haste to turn away from them, and took up a book, or hurried off to the club or to Apollon Nikolaevich Hess, to exchange the gossip of the town. Helene, who has never cared for anything but her own body, and is one of the stupidest women in the world, thought Pierre, is regarded by people as the acme of intelligence and refinement, and they pay homage to her. Napoleon Bonaparte was despised by all as long as he was great. But now that he has become a wretched comedian, the Emperor Francis wants to offer him his daughter in an illegal marriage. The Spaniards, through the Catholic clergy, offer praise to God for their victory over the French on the 14th of June. And the French, also through the Catholic clergy, offer praise because on that same 14th of June they defeated the Spaniards. My brother Masons swear by the blood that they are ready to sacrifice everything for their neighbor, but they do not give a ruble each to the collections for the poor, and they intrigue, the Estria lodge against the manna seekers, and fuss about an authentic Scotch carpet and a charter that nobody needs, and the meaning of which the very man who wrote it does not understand. We all profess the Christian law of forgiveness of injuries and love of our neighbors, the law and honor of which we have built in Moscow 40 times 40 churches. But yesterday a deserter was knouted to death, and a minister of that same law of love and forgiveness, a priest, gave the soldier a cross to kiss before his execution. So thought Pierre, and the whole of this general deception which everyone accepts, accustomed as he was to it, astonished him each time as if it were something new. I understand the deception and confusion, he thought, but how am I to tell them all that I see? I have tried, and have always found that they too in the depths of their souls understand it as I do, and only try not to see it. So it appears that it must be so. But what is to become of me, thought he. He had the unfortunate capacity many men, especially Russians, have of seeing and believing in the possibility of goodness and truth, but of seeing the evil and falsehood of life too clearly to be able to take a serious part in it. Every sphere of work was connected, in his eyes, with evil and deception. Whatever he tried to be, whatever he engaged in, the evil and falsehood of it repulsed him and blocked every path of activity. Yet he had to live and to find occupation. It was too dreadful to be under the burden of these insoluble problems, so he abandoned himself to any distraction in order to forget them. He frequented every kind of society, drank much, bought pictures, engaged in building, and above all, read. He read and read everything that came to hand. On coming home, while his valets were still taking off his things, he picked up a book and began to read. From reading he passed to sleeping, from sleeping to gossip in drawing rooms of the club, from gossip to carousals and women, from carousals back to gossip, reading, and wine. Drinking became more and more a physical, and also a moral necessity. Though the doctors warned him that with his corpulence wine was dangerous for him, he drank a great deal. He was only quite at ease when, having poured several glasses of wine mechanically into his large mouth, he felt a pleasant warmth in his body, an amiability toward all his fellows, and a readiness to respond superficially to every idea without probing it deeply. Only after emptying a bottle or two did he feel dimly that the terribly tangled skein of life, which previously had terrified him, was not as dreadful as he had thought. He was always conscious of some aspect of that skein, as with a buzzing in his head after dinner or supper, he chatted or listened to conversation or read. But under the influence of wine, he said to himself, "It doesn't matter. I'll get it unraveled. I have a solution ready, but have no time now. I'll think it all out later on." But the later on never came. In the morning, on an empty stomach, all the old questions appeared as insoluble and terrible as ever, and Pierre hastily picked up a book, and if anyone came to see him, he was glad. Sometimes he remembered how he had heard that soldiers in war, when entrenched under the enemy's fire, if they have nothing to do, try hard to find some occupation the more easily to bear the danger. To Pierre, all men seemed like those soldiers, seeking refuge from life, some in ambition, some in cards, some in framing laws, some in women, some in toys, some in horses, some in politics, some in sport, some in wine, and some in governmental affairs. Nothing is trivial and nothing is important, it's all the same, only to save oneself from it as best one can, thought Pierre. Only not to see it, that dreadful it. Chapter 2. At the beginning of winter, Prince Nicholas Bolkonsky and his daughter moved to Moscow. At that time, enthusiasm for the Emperor Alexander's regime had weakened, and a patriotic and anti-French tendency prevailed there. And this, together with his past and his intellect and his originality, at once made Prince Nicholas Bolkonsky an object of particular respect to the Muscovites and the center of the Moscow opposition to the government. The prince had aged very much that year. He showed marked signs of senility by a tendency to fall asleep, forgetfulness of quite recent events, remembrance of remote ones, and the childish vanity with which he accepted the role of head of the Moscow opposition. In spite of this, the old man inspired in all his visitors alike a feeling of respectful veneration, especially of an evening when he came in to tea in his old-fashioned coat and powdered wig, and, aroused by anyone, told his abrupt stories of the past, or uttered yet more abrupt and scathing criticisms of the present. For them all, that old-fashioned house with its gigantic mirrors, pre-revolution furniture, powdered footmen, and the stern, shrewd old man, himself a relic of the past century, with his gentle daughter and the pretty Frenchwoman who were reverently devoted to him, presented a majestic and agreeable spectacle. But the visitors did not reflect that besides the couple of hours during which they saw their host, there were also 22 hours in the day during which the private and intimate life of the house continued. Latterly, that private life had become very trying for Princess Mary. There in Moscow, she was deprived of her greatest pleasures, talks with the pilgrims, and the solitude which refreshed her at Bald Hills, and she had none of the advantages and pleasures of city life. She did not go out into society. Everyone knew that her father would not let her go anywhere without him, and his failing health prevented his going out himself, so that she was not invited to dinners and evening parties. She had quite abandoned the hope of getting married. She saw the coldness and malevolence with which the old prince received and dismissed the young men, possible suitors, who sometimes appeared at their house. She had no friends. During this visit to Moscow, she had been disappointed in the two who had been nearest to her. Mademoiselle Bourienne, with whom she had never been able to be quite frank, had now become unpleasant to her, and for various reasons Princess Mary avoided her. Julie, with whom she had corresponded for the last 5 years, was in Moscow, but proved to be quite alien to her when they met. Just then Julie, who by the death of her brothers had become one of the richest heiresses in Moscow, was in the full whirl of society pleasures. She was surrounded by young men who, she fancied, had suddenly learned to appreciate her worth. Julie was at that stage in the life of a society woman when she feels that her last chance of marrying has come and that her fate must be decided now or never. On Thursdays, Princess Mary remembered with a mournful smile that she now had no one to write to, since Julie, whose presence gave her no pleasure, was here, and they met every week. Like the old emigre who declined to marry the lady with whom he had spent his evenings for years, she regretted Julie's presence and having no one to write to. In Moscow, Princess Mary had no one to talk to, no one to whom to confide her sorrow, and much sorrow fell to her lot just then. The time for Prince Andrew's return and marriage was approaching, but his request to her to prepare his father for it had not been carried out. In fact, it seemed as if matters were quite hopeless, for at every mention of the young Countess Rostova the old prince, who apart from that was usually in a bad temper, lost control of himself. Another lately added sorrow arose from the lessons she gave her 6-year-old nephew. To her consternation, she detected in herself, in relation to little Nicholas, some symptoms of her father's irritability. However often she told herself that she must not get irritable when teaching her nephew, almost every time that, pointer in hand, she sat down to show him the French alphabet, she so longed to pour her own knowledge quickly and easily into the child, who was already afraid that Auntie might at any moment get angry, that at his slightest inattention she trembled, became flustered and heated, raised her voice, and sometimes pulled him by the arm and put him in the corner. Having put him in the corner, she would herself begin to cry over her cruel, evil nature, and little Nicholas, following her example, would sob, and without permission would leave his corner, come to her, pull her wet hands from her face, and comfort her. But what distressed the princess most of all was her father's irritability, which was always directed against her and had of late amounted to cruelty. Had he forced her to prostrate herself to the ground all night, had he beaten her or made her fetch wood or water, it would never have entered her mind to think her position hard. But this loving despot, the more cruel because he loved her, and for that reason tormented himself and her, knew how not merely to hurt and humiliate her deliberately, but to show her that she was always to blame for everything. Of late, he had exhibited a new trait that tormented Princess Mary more than anything else. This was his ever-increasing intimacy with Mademoiselle Bourienne. The idea that at the first moment of receiving the news of his son's intentions had occurred to him in jest, that if Andrew got married he himself would marry Bourienne, had evidently pleased him, and latterly he had persistently, and as it seemed to Princess Mary merely to offend her, shown special endearments to the companion and expressed his dissatisfaction with his daughter by demonstrations of love of Bourienne. One day in Moscow in Princess Mary's presence, she thought her father did it purposely when she was there. The old prince kissed Mademoiselle Bourienne's hand and, drawing her to him, embraced her affectionately. Princess Mary flushed and ran out of the room. A few minutes later, Mademoiselle Bourienne came into Princess Mary's room smiling and making cheerful remarks in her agreeable voice. Princess Mary hastily wiped away her tears, went resolutely up to Mademoiselle Bourienne, and evidently unconscious of what she was doing, began shouting in angry haste at the Frenchwoman, her voice breaking. "It's horrible, vile, inhuman to take advantage of the weakness." She did not finish. "Leave my room," she exclaimed and burst into sobs. Next day the prince did not say a word to his daughter, but she noticed that at dinner he gave orders that Mademoiselle Bourienne should be served first. After dinner, when the footman handed coffee and from habit began with the princess, the prince suddenly grew furious, threw his stick at Philip, and instantly gave instructions to have him conscripted for the army. "He doesn't obey. I said it twice. And he doesn't obey. She is the first person in this house. She's my best friend," cried the prince. "And if you allow yourself," he screamed in a fury, addressing Princess Mary for the first time, "to forget yourself again before her as you dared to do yesterday, I will show you who is master in this house. Go." Don't let me set eyes on you, beg her pardon." Princess Mary asked Mademoiselle Bourienne's pardon, and also her father's pardon for herself and for Philip the footman, who had begged for her intervention. At such moments, something like a pride of sacrifice gathered in her soul. And suddenly that father whom she had judged would look for his spectacles in her presence, fumbling near them and not seeing them, or would forget something that had just occurred, or take a false step with his failing legs and turn to see if anyone had noticed his feebleness. Or, worst of all, at dinner when there were no visitors to excite him, would suddenly fall asleep, letting his napkin drop and his shaking head sink over his plate. "He is old and feeble, and I dare to condemn him," she thought at such moments, with a feeling of revulsion against herself. Chapter 3. In 1811, there was living in Moscow a French doctor, Medivir, who had rapidly become the fashion. He was enormously tall, handsome, amiable as Frenchmen are, and was, as all Moscow said, an extraordinarily clever doctor. He was received in the best houses not merely as a doctor, but as an equal. Prince Nicholas had always ridiculed medicine, but latterly, on Mademoiselle Bourienne's advice, had allowed this doctor to visit him and had grown accustomed to him. Medivir came to see the prince about twice a week. On December 6, St. Nicholas Day and the prince's name day, all Moscow came to the prince's front door, but he gave orders to admit no one and to invite to dinner only a small number, a list of whom he gave to Princess Mary. Medivir, who came in the morning with his felicitations, considered it proper in his quality of Doctor de Forcer la Consigne, as he told Princess Mary, and went in to see the prince. It happened that on that morning of his name day, the prince was in one of his worst moods. He had been going about the house all the morning finding fault with everyone, and pretending not to understand what was said to him and not to be understood himself. Princess Mary well knew this mood of quiet, absorbed querulousness, which generally culminated in a burst of rage, and she went about all that morning as though facing a cocked and loaded gun and awaited the inevitable explosion. Until the doctor's arrival, the morning had passed off safely. After admitting the doctor, Princess Mary sat down with a book in the drawing room near the door through which she could hear all that passed in the study. To force the guard. At first she heard only Medivir's voice, then her father's, then both voices began speaking at the same time. The door was flung open, and on the threshold appeared the handsome figure of the terrified Medivir with his shock of black hair, and the prince in his dressing gown and fez, his face distorted with fury and the pupils of his eyes rolled downwards. "You don't understand," shouted the prince, "but I do. French spy, slave of Bonaparte, spy, get out of my house. Be off, I tell you," and he slammed the door. Medivir, shrugging his shoulders, went up to Mademoiselle Bourienne, who at the sound of shouting had run in from an adjoining room. "The prince is not very well, bile and rush of blood to the head." "Keep calm, I will call again tomorrow," said Medivir, and putting his fingers to his lips he hastened away. Through the study door came the sound of slippered feet and the cry, "Spies, traitors, traitors everywhere. Not a moment's peace in my own house." After Medivir's departure the old prince called his daughter in, and the whole weight of his wrath fell on her. She was to blame that a spy had been admitted. Had he not told her, yes, told her to make a list, and not to admit anyone who was not on that list? Then why was that scoundrel admitted? She was the cause of it all. With her, he said, he could not have a moment's peace and could not die quietly. "No, ma'am. We must part, we must part. Understand that, understand it. I cannot endure any more," he said, and left the room. Then, as if afraid she might find some means of consolation, he returned and, trying to appear calm, added, "And don't imagine I have said this in a moment of anger. I am calm. I have thought it over, and it will be carried out. We must part, so find some place for yourself." But he could not restrain himself, and with the virulence of which only one who loves is capable, evidently suffering himself, he shook his fists at her and screamed. If only some fool would marry her. Then he slammed the door, sent for Mademoiselle Bourienne, and subsided into his study. At 2 o'clock, the 6 chosen guests assembled for dinner. These guests, the famous Count Rostopchin, Prince Lopukhin with his nephew, General Chatrov, an old war comrade of the Prince S., and of the younger generation peer and Boris Drubetskoy, awaited the prince in the drawing room. Boris, who had come to Moscow on leave a few days before, had been anxious to be presented to Prince Nicholas Bolkonsky, and had contrived to ingratiate himself so well that the old prince in his case made an exception to the rule of not receiving bachelors in his house. The prince's house did not belong to what is known as fashionable society, but his little circle, though not much talked about in town, was one it was more flattering to be received in than any other. Boris had realized this the week before when the commander-in-chief in his presence invited Rostopchin to dinner on St. Nicholas Day, and Rostopchin had replied that he could not come. On that day, I always go to pay my devotions to the relics of Prince Nicholas Bolkonsky. Oh yes, yes, replied the commander-in-chief. How is he? The small group that assembled before dinner in the lofty old-fashioned drawing room with its old furniture resembled the solemn gathering of a court of justice. All were silent or talked in low tones. Prince Nicholas came in serious and taciturn. Princess Mary seemed even quieter and more diffident than usual. The guests were reluctant to address her, feeling that she was in no mood for their conversation. Count Rostopchin alone kept the conversation going, now relating the latest town news and now the latest political gossip. Lopukhin and the old general occasionally took part in the conversation. Prince Bolkonsky listened as a presiding judge receives a report, only now and then, silently or by a brief word, showing that he took heed of what was being reported to him. The tone of the conversation was such as indicated that no one approved of what was being done in the political world. Incidents were related evidently confirming the opinion that everything was going from bad to worse, but whether telling a story or giving an opinion, the speaker always stopped, or was stopped, at the point beyond which his criticism might touch the sovereign himself. At dinner, the talk turned on the latest political news, Napoleon's seizure of the Duke of Oldenburg's territory, and the Russian note, hostile to Napoleon, which had been sent to all the European courts. Bonaparte treats Europe as a pirate does a captured vessel, said Count Rostopchin, repeating a phrase he had uttered several times before. One only wonders at the long-suffering or blindness of the crowned heads. Now the Pope's turn has come, and Bonaparte doesn't scruple to depose the head of the Catholic Church, yet all keep silent. Our sovereign alone has protested against the seizure of the Duke of Oldenburg's territory, and even, Count Rostopchin paused, feeling that he had reached the limit beyond which censure was impossible. Other territories have been offered in exchange for the Duchy of Oldenburg, said Prince Bolkonsky. He shifts the dukes about as I might move my serfs from Bald Hills to Bogocharovo or my Ryazan estates. The Duke of Oldenburg bears his misfortunes with admirable strength of character and resignation, remarked Boris, joining in respectfully. He said this because on his journey from Petersburg, he had had the honor of being presented to the Duke. Prince Bolkonsky glanced at the young man as if about to say something in reply, but changed his mind, evidently considering him too young. I have read our protests about the Oldenburg affair and was surprised how badly the note was worded, remarked Count Rostopchin in the casual tone of a man dealing with a subject quite familiar to him. Pierre looked at Rostopchin with naive astonishment, not understanding why he should be disturbed by the bad composition of the note. Does it matter, Count, how the note is worded, he asked, so long as its substance is forcible? My dear fellow, with our 500,000 troops, it should be easy to have a good style, returned Count Rostopchin. Pierre now understood the Count's dissatisfaction with the wording of the note. One would have thought quill drivers enough had sprung up, remarked the old prince. There in Petersburg they are always writing, not notes only but even new laws. My Andrew, there has written a whole volume of laws for Russia. Nowadays they are always writing, and he laughed unnaturally. There was a momentary pause in the conversation. The old general cleared his throat to draw attention. Did you hear of the last event at the review in Petersburg? The figure cut by the new French ambassador. Eh? Yes, I heard something. He said something awkward in His Majesty's presence. His Majesty drew attention to the Grenadier Division and to the march past, continued the general, And it seems the ambassador took no notice and allowed himself to reply that, "We in France pay no attention to such trifles." The emperor did not condescend to reply. At the next review, they say, the emperor did not once deign to address him. All were silent. On this fact relating to the emperor personally, it was impossible to pass any judgment. "Impudent fellows," said the prince. "You know Medivir. I turned him out of my house this morning. He was here, they admitted him in spite of my request that they should let no one in," he went on, glancing angrily at his daughter. And he narrated his whole conversation with the French doctor and the reasons that convinced him that Medivir was a spy. Though these reasons were very insufficient and obscure, no one made any rejoinder. After the roast, champagne was served. The guests rose to congratulate the old prince. Princess Mary, too, went round to him. He gave her a cold, angry look and offered her his wrinkled, clean-shaven cheek to kiss. The whole expression of his face told her that he had not forgotten the morning's talk, that his decision remained in force, and only the presence of visitors hindered his speaking of it to her now. When they went into the drawing room where coffee was served, the old men sat together. Prince Nicholas grew more animated and expressed his views on the impending war. He said that our wars with Bonaparte would be disastrous so long as we sought alliances with the Germans and thrust ourselves into European affairs, into which we had been drawn by the Peace of Tilsit. We ought not to fight either for or against Austria. Our political interests are all in the East, and in regard to Bonaparte the only thing is to have an armed frontier and a firm policy, and he will never dare to cross the Russian frontier, as was the case in 1807. "How can we fight the French, Prince?" said Count Rostopchin. "Can we arm ourselves against our teachers and divinities? Look at our youths, look at our ladies. The French are our gods, Paris is our kingdom of heaven." He began speaking louder, evidently to be heard by everyone. "French dresses, French ideas, French feelings. There now, you turned Medivir out by the scruff of his neck, because he is a Frenchman and a scoundrel. But our ladies crawl after him on their knees. I went to a party last night, and there out of 5 ladies 3 were Roman Catholics and had the Pope's indulgence for doing woolwork on Sundays. And they themselves sit there nearly naked, like the signboards at our public baths, if I may say so. Ah, when one looks at our young people, Prince, one would like to take Peter the Great's old cudgel out of the museum and belabor them in the Russian way till all the nonsense jumps out of them." All were silent. The old prince looked at Rostopchin with a smile and wagged his head approvingly. "Well, goodbye, Your Excellency, keep well," said Rostopchin, getting up with characteristic briskness and holding out his hand to the prince. "Goodbye, my dear fellow. His words are music, I never tire of hearing him," said the old prince, keeping hold of the hand and offering his cheek to be kissed. Following Rostopchin's example, the others also rose. Chapter 4. Princess Mary, as she sat listening to the old men's talk and fault-finding, understood nothing of what she heard. She only wondered whether the guests had all observed her father's hostile attitude toward her. She did not even notice the special attentions and amiabilities shown her during dinner by Boris Drubetskoy, who was visiting them for the 3rd time already. Princess Mary turned with absent-minded questioning look to Pierre, who hat in hand and with a smile on his face was the last of the guests to approach her after the old prince had gone out, and they were left alone in the drawing-room. "May I stay a little longer?" he said, letting his stout body sink into an armchair beside her. "Oh yes," she answered. "You notice nothing?" her look asked. Pierre was in an agreeable after-dinner mood. He looked straight before him and smiled quietly. "Have you known that young man long, Princess?" he asked. "Who? Drubetskoy." "No, not long." "Do you like him?" "Yes, he is an agreeable young man." "Why do you ask me that?" said Princess Mary, still thinking of that morning's conversation with her father. "Because I have noticed that when a young man comes on leave from Petersburg to Moscow, it is usually with the object of marrying an heiress." "You have observed that," said Princess Mary. "Yes," returned Pierre with a smile. "And this young man now manages matters so that where there is a wealthy heiress there he is too. I can read him like a book." At present he is hesitating whom to lay siege to, you or Mademoiselle Julie Karagina. He is very attentive to her. He visits them. Yes, very often. And do you know the new way of courting? Said Pierre with an amused smile, evidently in that cheerful mood of good-humored raillery for which he so often reproached himself in his diary. No, replied Princess Mary. To please Moscow girls, nowadays one has to be melancholy. He is very melancholy with Mademoiselle Karagina, said Pierre. Really? Asked Princess Mary, looking into Pierre's kindly face and still thinking of her own sorrow. It would be a relief, thought she, if I ventured to confide what I am feeling to someone. I should like to tell everything to Pierre. He is kind and generous. It would be a relief. He would give me advice. Would you marry him? Oh my God, Count, there are moments when I would marry anybody. She cried suddenly to her own surprise and with tears in her voice. Ah, how bitter it is to love someone near to you and to feel that. She went on in a trembling voice, that you can do nothing for him but grieve him, and to know that you cannot alter this. Then there is only one thing left, to go away, but where could I go? What is wrong? What is it, Princess? But without finishing what she was saying, Princess Mary burst into tears. I don't know what is the matter with me today. Don't take any notice, forget what I have said. Pierre's gaiety vanished completely. He anxiously questioned the princess, asked her to speak out fully and confide her grief to him. But she only repeated that she begged him to forget what she had said, that she did not remember what she had said, and that she had no trouble except the one he knew of, that Prince Andrew's marriage threatened to cause a rupture between father and son. Have you any news of the Rostovs? She asked to change the subject. I was told they are coming soon. I am also expecting Andrew any day. I should like them to meet here. And how does he now regard the matter? Asked Pierre, referring to the old prince. Princess Mary shook her head. What is to be done? In a few months, the year will be up. The thing is impossible. I only wish I could spare my brother the first moments. I wish they would come sooner. I hope to be friends with her. You have known them a long time, said Princess Mary. Tell me honestly the whole truth. What sort of girl is she, and what do you think of her? The real truth, because you know Andrew is risking so much doing this against his father's will that I should like to know. An undefined instinct told Pierre that these explanations, and repeated requests to be told the whole truth, expressed ill will on the princess, part toward her future sister-in-law and a wish that he should disapprove of Andrew's choice. But in reply, he said what he felt rather than what he thought. I don't know how to answer your question, he said, blushing without knowing why. I really don't know what sort of girl she is. I can't analyze her at all. She is enchanting, but what makes her so I don't know. That is all one can say about her. Princess Mary sighed, and the expression on her face said, Yes, that's what I expected and feared. Is she clever? She asked. Pierre considered. I think not, he said, and yet yes. She does not deign to be clever. Oh no, she is simply enchanting, and that is all. Princess Mary again shook her head disapprovingly. Ah, I so long to like her. Tell her so if you see her before I do. I hear they are expected very soon, said Pierre. Princess Mary told Pierre of her plan to become intimate with her future sister-in-law as soon as the Rostovs arrived, and to try to accustom the old prince to her. Chapter 5. Boris had not succeeded in making a wealthy match in Petersburg, so with the same object in view he came to Moscow. There he wavered between the two richest heiresses, Julie and Princess Mary. Though Princess Mary, despite her plainness, seemed to him more attractive than Julie, he, without knowing why, felt awkward about paying court to her. When they had last met on the old prince's name day, she had answered at random all his attempts to talk sentimentally, evidently not listening to what he was saying. Julie, on the contrary, accepted his attentions readily, though in a manner peculiar to herself. She was 27. After the death of her brothers, she had become very wealthy. She was by now decidedly plain, but thought herself not merely as good-looking as before, but even far more attractive. She was confirmed in this delusion by the fact that she had become a very wealthy heiress, and also by the fact that the older she grew, the less dangerous she became to men, and the more freely they could associate with her and avail themselves of her suppers, soirees, and the animated company that assembled at her house, without incurring any obligation. A man who would have been afraid 10 years before of going every day to the house when there was a girl of 17 there, for fear of compromising her and committing himself, would now go boldly every day and treat her not as a marriageable girl, but as a sexless acquaintance. That winter the Kuragins' house was the most agreeable and hospitable in Moscow. In addition to the formal evening and dinner parties, a large company, chiefly of men, gathered there every day, supping at midnight and staying till 3 in the morning. Julie never missed a ball, a promenade, or a play. Her dresses were always of the latest fashion. But in spite of that, she seemed to be disillusioned about everything and told everyone that she did not believe either in friendship or in love or any of the joys of life, and expected peace only yonder. She adopted the tone of one who has suffered a great disappointment, like a girl who has either lost the man she loved or been cruelly deceived by him. Though nothing of the kind had happened to her, she was regarded in that light, and had even herself come to believe that she had suffered much in life. This melancholy, which did not prevent her amusing herself, did not hinder the young people who came to her house from passing the time pleasantly. Every visitor who came to the house paid his tribute to the melancholy mood of the hostess, and then amused himself with society gossip, dancing, intellectual games, and bouts rhymes, which were in vogue at the Kuragins'. Only a few of these young men, among them Boris, entered more deeply into Julie's melancholy, and with these she had prolonged conversations in private on the vanity of all worldly things, and to them she showed her albums filled with mournful sketches, maxims, and verses. To Boris, Julie was particularly gracious. She regretted his early disillusionment with life, offered him such consolation of friendship as she who had herself suffered so much could render, and showed him her album. Boris sketched 2 trees in the album and wrote, "Rustic trees, your dark branches shed gloom and melancholy upon me." On another page he drew a tomb and wrote, "La mort est sécurable, et la mort est tranquille. Ah, contre les douleurs, il n'est pas d'autre asile." Death gives relief and death is peaceful. Ah, from suffering there is no other refuge. Julie said this was charming. "There is something so enchanting in the smile of melancholy," she said to Boris, repeating word for word a passage she had copied from a book. "It is a ray of light in the darkness, a shade between sadness and despair, showing the possibility of consolation." In reply, Boris wrote these lines: "Aliment de poison d'uname trop sensible toi, sans que le bonheur serrate impossible, tender melancholy. Ah, viens me consoler. Viens calmer les tourments de ma sombre retraite, et merle une douceur secrète et ces pleurs que sens cooler." Poisonous nourishment of a too sensitive soul, thou, without whom happiness would for me be impossible, tender melancholy. Ah, come to console me, come to calm the torments of my gloomy retreat, and mingle a secret sweetness with these tears that I feel to be flowing. For Boris, Julie played most doleful nocturnes on her harp. Boris read Poor Lisa aloud to her, and more than once interrupted the reading, because of the emotions that choked him. Meeting at large gatherings, Julie and Boris looked on one another as the only souls who understood one another in a world of indifferent people. Anna Pavlovna, who often visited the Kuragins', while playing cards with the mother, made careful inquiries as to Julie's dowry. She was to have 2 estates in Penza and the Nizhegorod forests. Anna Pavlovna regarded the refined sadness that united her son to the wealthy Julie with emotion and resignation to the divine will. "You are always charming and melancholy, my dear Julie," she said to the daughter. "Boris says his soul finds repose at your house. He has suffered so many disappointments and is so sensitive," said she to the mother. "Ah, my dear, I can't tell you how fond I have grown of Julie latterly," she said to her son. "But who could help loving her? She is an angelic being. Ah, Boris, Boris," she paused. "And how I pity her mother," she went on. "Today she showed me her accounts and letters from Penza. They have enormous estates there, and she, poor thing, has no one to help her, and they do cheat her so." Boris smiled almost imperceptibly while listening to his mother. He laughed blandly at her naive diplomacy, but listened to what she had to say, and sometimes questioned her carefully about the Penza and Nizhegorod estates. Julie had long been expecting a proposal from her melancholy adorer and was ready to accept it. But some secret feeling of repulsion for her passionate desire to get married, for her artificiality, and a feeling of horror at renouncing the possibility of real love still restrained Boris. His leave was expiring. He spent every day and whole days at the Kuragins, and every day on thinking the matter over told himself that he would propose tomorrow. But in Julie's presence, looking at her red face and chin, nearly always powdered, her moist eyes, and her expression of continual readiness to pass at once from melancholy to an unnatural rapture of married bliss, Boris could not utter the decisive words, though in imagination he had long regarded himself as the possessor of those Penza and Nizhegorod estates and had apportioned the use of the income from them. Julie saw Boris, indecision, and sometimes the thought occurred to her that she was repulsive to him, but her feminine self-deception immediately supplied her with consolation, and she told herself that he was only shy from love. Her melancholy, however, began to turn to irritability, and not long before Boris' departure, she formed a definite plan of action. Just as Boris' leave of absence was expiring, Anatole Kuragin made his appearance in Moscow, and of course in the Kuragins' drawing room, and Julie, suddenly abandoning her melancholy, became cheerful and very attentive to Kuragin. "My dear," said Anna Mikhailovna to her son, "I know from a reliable source that Prince Vasili has sent his son to Moscow to get him married to Julie. I am so fond of Julie that I should be sorry for her. What do you think of it, my dear? The idea of being made a fool of and of having thrown away that whole month of arduous, melancholy service to Julie, and of seeing all the revenue from the Penza estates which he had already mentally apportioned and put to proper use fall into the hands of another, and especially into the hands of that idiot Anatole," pained Boris. He drove to the Kuragins with the firm intention of proposing. Julie met him in a gay, careless manner, spoke casually of how she had enjoyed yesterday's ball, and asked when he was leaving. Though Boris had come intentionally to speak of his love and therefore meant to be tender, he began speaking irritably of feminine inconstancy, of how easily women can turn from sadness to joy, and how their moods depend solely on who happens to be paying court to them. Julie was offended and replied that it was true that a woman needs variety, and the same thing over and over again would weary anyone. "Then I should advise you," Boris began, wishing to sting her. But at that instant the galling thought occurred to him that he might have to leave Moscow without having accomplished his aim and have vainly wasted his efforts, which was a thing he never allowed to happen. He checked himself in the middle of the sentence, lowered his eyes to avoid seeing her unpleasantly irritated and irresolute face, and said, "I did not come here at all to quarrel with you. On the contrary." He glanced at her to make sure that he might go on. Her irritability had suddenly quite vanished, and her anxious, imploring eyes were fixed on him with greedy expectation. "I can always arrange so as not to see her often," thought Boris. "The affair has been begun and must be finished." He blushed hotly, raised his eyes to hers, and said, "You know my feelings for you." There was no need to say more. Julie's face shone with triumph and self-satisfaction, but she forced Boris to say all that is said on such occasions, that he loved her and had never loved any other woman more than her. She knew that for the Penza estates and Nizhegorod forests she could demand this, and she received what she demanded. The affianced couple, no longer alluding to trees that shed gloom and melancholy upon them, planned the arrangements of a splendid house in Petersburg, paid calls, and prepared everything for a brilliant wedding. Chapter 6. At the end of January, old Count Rostov went to Moscow with Natasha and Sonia. The Countess was still unwell and unable to travel, but it was impossible to wait for her recovery. Prince Andrew was expected in Moscow any day, the trousseau had to be ordered, and the estate near Moscow had to be sold, besides which the opportunity of presenting his future daughter-in-law to old Prince Bolkonsky while he was in Moscow could not be missed. The Rostovs, Moscow house had not been heated that winter, and, as they had come only for a short time, and the countess was not with them, the count decided to stay with Maria Dmitrievna Akrasimova, who had long been pressing her hospitality on them. Late one evening, the Rostovs, 4 sleighs drove into Maria Dmitrievna's courtyard in the old Konyashny street. Maria Dmitrievna lived alone. She had already married off her daughter, and her sons were all in the service. She held herself as erect, told everyone her opinion as candidly, loudly, and bluntly as ever, and her whole bearing seemed a reproach to others for any weakness, passion, or temptation, the possibility of which she did not admit. From early in the morning, wearing a dressing jacket, she attended to her household affairs, and then she drove out, on holy days to church, and after the service to jails and prisons on affairs of which she never spoke to anyone. On ordinary days, after dressing, she received petitioners of various classes, of whom there were always some. Then she had dinner, a substantial and appetizing meal at which there were always 3 or 4 guests. After dinner, she played a game of Boston, and at night she had the newspapers or a new book read to her while she knitted. She rarely made an exception and went out to pay visits, and then only to the most important persons in the town. She had not yet gone to bed when the Rostovs arrived, and the pulley of the hall door squeaked from the cold as it let in the Rostovs and their servants. Maria Dmitrievna, with her spectacles hanging down on her nose and her head flung back, stood in the hall doorway looking with a stern, grim face at the new arrivals. One might have thought she was angry with the travelers and would immediately turn them out, had she not at the same time been giving careful instructions to the servants for the accommodation of the visitors and their belongings. The count's things. "Bring them here," she said, pointing to the portmanteaus and not greeting anyone. "The young ladies. There to the left. Now what are you dawdling for?" she cried to the maids. "Get the samovar ready. You've grown plumper and prettier," she remarked, drawing Natasha, whose cheeks were glowing from the cold, to her by the hood. "Phew! You are cold. Now take off your things quick," she shouted to the count, who was going to kiss her hand. "You're half frozen, I'm sure. Bring some rum for tea. Bonjour, Sonia dear," she added, turning to Sonia and indicating by this French greeting her slightly contemptuous though affectionate attitude toward her. When they came in to tea, having taken off their outdoor things and tidied themselves up after their journey, Maria Dmitrievna kissed them all in due order. "I'm heartily glad you have come and are staying with me. It was high time," she said, giving Natasha a significant look. "The old man is here, and his son's expected any day. You'll have to make his acquaintance. But we'll speak of that later on," she added, glancing at Sonia with a look that showed she did not want to speak of it in her presence. "Now listen," she said to the count. "What do you want tomorrow? Whom will you send for?" "Shinshin," she crooked one of her fingers. "The sniveling Anna Mikhailovna. That's two. She's here with her son. The son is getting married. Then Bezikov, eh? He is here too, with his wife. He ran away from her, and she came galloping after him. He dined with me on Wednesday. As for them," and she pointed to the girls, "tomorrow I'll take them first to the Iberian shrine of the Mother of God, and then we'll drive to the Super Rogues. I suppose you'll have everything new. Don't judge by me, sleeves nowadays are this size. The other day young Princess Irina Vasilovna came to see me. She was an awful sight, looked as if she had put 2 barrels on her arms. You know, not a day passes now without some new fashion. And what have you to do yourself?" she asked the count sternly. "One thing has come on top of another. Her rags to buy, and now a purchaser has turned up for the Moscow estate and for the house. If you will be so kind, I'll fix a time and go down to the estate just for a day and leave my lasses with you." "All right. All right. They'll be safe with me, as safe as in Chancery. I'll take them where they must go, scold them a bit, and pet them a bit," said Maria Dmitrievna, touching her goddaughter and favorite, Natasha, on the cheek with her large hand. Next morning, Maria Dmitrievna took the young ladies to the Iberian shrine of the Mother of God, and to Madame Sapertrogit, who was so afraid of Maria Dmitrievna that she always let her have costumes at a loss merely to get rid of her. Maria Dmitrievna ordered almost the whole trousseau. When they got home, she turned everybody out of the room except Natasha, and then called her pet to her armchair. "Well, now we'll talk. I congratulate you on your betrothed. You've hooked a fine fellow. I am glad for your sake, and I've known him since he was so high." She held her hand a couple of feet from the ground. Natasha blushed happily. "I like him and all his family. Now listen. You know that old Prince Nicholas much dislikes his sons marrying. The old fellow's crotchety. Of course, Prince Andrew is not a child and can shift without him, but it's not nice to enter a family against a father's will. One wants to do it peacefully and lovingly. You're a clever girl, and you'll know how to manage. Be kind and use your wits. Then all will be well." Natasha remained silent, from shyness Maria Dmitrievna supposed, but really because she disliked anyone interfering in what touched her love of Prince Andrew, which seemed to her so apart from all human affairs that no one could understand it. She loved and knew Prince Andrew. He loved her only, and was to come one of these days and take her. She wanted nothing more. "You see, I have known him a long time and am also fond of Mary, your future sister-in-law. Husbands, sisters bring up blisters, but this one wouldn't hurt a fly. She has asked me to bring you two together. Tomorrow you'll go with your father to see her. Be very nice and affectionate to her. You're younger than she. When he comes, he'll find you already know his sister and father and are liked by them. Am I right or not? Won't that be best?" "Yes, it will," Natasha answered reluctantly. Chapter 7. Next day, by Maria Dmitrievna's advice, Count Rostov took Natasha to call on Prince Nicholas Bolkonsky. The Count did not set out cheerfully on this visit. At heart, he felt afraid. He well remembered the last interview he had had with the old prince at the time of the enrollment, when in reply to an invitation to dinner, he had had to listen to an angry reprimand for not having provided his full quota of men. Natasha, on the other hand, having put on her best gown, was in the highest spirits. "They can't help liking me," she thought. "Everybody always has liked me, and I am so willing to do anything they wish, so ready to be fond of him for being his father, and of her for being his sister, that there is no reason for them not to like me." They drove up to the gloomy old house on the Vozdvizhenka and entered the vestibule. "Well, the Lord have mercy on us," said the Count, half in jest, half in earnest, but Natasha noticed that her father was flurried on entering the anteroom and inquired timidly and softly whether the prince and princess were at home. When they had been announced, a perturbation was noticeable among the servants. The footman who had gone to announce them was stopped by another in the large hall, and they whispered to one another. Then a maidservant ran into the hall and hurriedly said something, mentioning the princess. At last an old, cross-looking footman came and announced to the Rostovs that the prince was not receiving, but that the princess begged them to walk up. The first person who came to meet the visitors was Mademoiselle Bourienne. She greeted the father and daughter with special politeness and showed them to the princess' room. The princess, looking excited and nervous, her face flushed in patches, ran in to meet the visitors, treading heavily and vainly trying to appear cordial and at ease. From the first glance, Princess Mary did not like Natasha. She thought her too fashionably dressed, frivolously gay and vain. She did not at all realize that before having seen her future sister-in-law, she was prejudiced against her by involuntary envy of her beauty, youth, and happiness, as well as by jealousy of her brother's love for her. Apart from this insuperable antipathy to her, Princess Mary was agitated just then because on the Rostovs being announced, the old prince had shouted that he did not wish to see them, that Princess Mary might do so if she chose, but they were not to be admitted to him. She had decided to receive them, but feared lest the prince might at any moment indulge in some freak, as he seemed much upset by the Rostovs' visit. "There, my dear princess, I've brought you my songstress," said the Count, bowing and looking round uneasily as if afraid the old prince might appear. "I am so glad you should get to know one another. Very sorry the prince is still ailing," and after a few more commonplace remarks he rose. "If you'll allow me to leave my Natasha in your hands for a quarter of an hour, princess, I'll drive round to see Anna Semenovna. It's quite near in the Dogs' Square, and then I'll come back for her." The Count had devised this diplomatic ruse, as he afterwards told his daughter, to give the future sisters-in-law an opportunity to talk to one another freely. But another motive was to avoid the danger of encountering the old prince, of whom he was afraid. He did not mention this to his daughter, but Natasha noticed her father's nervousness and anxiety and felt mortified by it. She blushed for him, grew still angrier at having blushed, and looked at the princess with a bold and defiant expression, which said that she was not afraid of anybody. The princess told the Count that she would be delighted, and only begged him to stay longer at Anna Semyonovna's, and he departed. Despite the uneasy glances thrown at her by Princess Mary, who wished to have a tête-à-tête with Natasha, Mademoiselle Bourienne remained in the room and persistently talked about Moscow amusements and theaters. Natasha felt offended by the hesitation she had noticed in the anteroom, by her father's nervousness, and by the unnatural manner of the princess who, she thought, was making a favor of receiving her, and so everything displeased her. She did not like Princess Mary, whom she thought very plain, affected, and dry. Natasha suddenly shrank into herself, and involuntarily assumed an offhand air which alienated Princess Mary still more. After 5 minutes of irksome, constrained conversation, they heard the sound of slippered feet rapidly approaching. Princess Mary looked frightened. The door opened, and the old prince, in a dressing gown and a white nightcap, came in. "Ah, madam," he began. "Madam Countess. Countess Rostova, if I am not mistaken. I beg you to excuse me, to excuse me. I did not know, madam. God is my witness, I did not know you had honored us with a visit, and I came in such a costume only to see my daughter. I beg you to excuse me. God is my witness, I didn't know," he repeated, stressing the word God, so unnaturally and so unpleasantly that Princess Mary stood with downcast eyes, not daring to look either at her father or at Natasha. Nor did the latter, having risen and curtsied, know what to do. Mademoiselle Bourienne alone smiled agreeably. "I beg you to excuse me, excuse me. God is my witness, I did not know," muttered the old man, and after looking Natasha over from head to foot, he went out. Mademoiselle Bourienne was the first to recover herself after this apparition, and began speaking about the prince's indisposition. Natasha and Princess Mary looked at one another in silence, and the longer they did so without saying what they wanted to say, the greater grew their antipathy to one another. When the Count returned, Natasha was impolitely pleased and hastened to get away. At that moment she hated the stiff, elderly princess, who could place her in such an embarrassing position, and had spent half an hour with her without once mentioning Prince Andrew. "I couldn't begin talking about him in the presence of that Frenchwoman," thought Natasha. The same thought was meanwhile tormenting Princess Mary. She knew what she ought to have said to Natasha, but she had been unable to say it because Mademoiselle Bourienne was in the way, and because, without knowing why, she felt it very difficult to speak of the marriage. When the Count was already leaving the room, Princess Mary went up hurriedly to Natasha, took her by the hand, and said with a deep sigh, "Wait, I must." Natasha glanced at her ironically, without knowing why. "Dear Natalie," said Princess Mary, "I want you to know that I am glad my brother has found happiness." She paused, feeling that she was not telling the truth. Natasha noticed this and guessed its reason. "I think, Princess, it is not convenient to speak of that now," she said with external dignity and coldness, though she felt the tears choking her. "What have I said and what have I done?" thought she as soon as she was out of the room. They waited a long time for Natasha to come to dinner that day. She sat in her room crying like a child, blowing her nose and sobbing. Sonia stood beside her, kissing her hair. "Natasha, what is it about?" she asked. "What do they matter to you?" "It will all pass, Natasha." But if you only knew how offensive it was. As if I... Don't talk about it, Natasha. It wasn't your fault, so why should you mind? "Kiss me," said Sonia. Natasha raised her head, and kissing her friend on the lips, pressed her wet face against her. "I can't tell you, I don't know." "No one's to blame," said Natasha. "It's my fault. But it all hurts terribly. Oh, why doesn't he come?" She came in to dinner with red eyes. Maria Dmitrievna, who knew how the prince had received the Rostovs, pretended not to notice how upset Natasha was and jested resolutely and loudly at table with the count and the other guests. Chapter 8. That evening, the Rostovs went to the opera, for which Maria Dmitrievna had taken a box. Natasha did not want to go, but could not refuse Maria Dmitrievna's kind offer, which was intended expressly for her. When she came ready dressed into the ballroom to await her father, and looking in the large mirror there saw that she was pretty, very pretty, she felt even more sad, but it was a sweet, tender sadness. Oh God, if you were here now I would not behave as I did then, but differently. I would not be silly and afraid of things. I would simply embrace him, cling to him, and make him look at me with those searching, inquiring eyes with which he has so often looked at me. And then I would make him laugh as he used to laugh. And his eyes, how I see those eyes, thought Natasha. And what do his father and sister matter to me? I love him alone, him, with that face and those eyes, with his smile, manly and yet childlike. No, I had better not think of him but forget him, quite forget him for the present. I can't bear this waiting and I shall cry in a minute. And she turned away from the glass, making an effort not to cry. And how can Sonia love Nicholas so calmly and quietly and wait so long and so patiently? Thought she, looking at Sonia, who also came in quite ready, with a fan in her hand. No, she's altogether different. Natasha at that moment felt so softened and tender that it was not enough for her to love and know she was beloved. She wanted now, at once, to embrace the man she loved, to speak and hear from him words of love such as filled her heart. While she sat in the carriage beside her father, pensively watching the lights of the street lamps flickering on the frozen window, she felt still sadder and more in love, and forgot where she was going and with whom. Having fallen into the line of carriages, the Rostovs' carriage drove up to the theater, its wheels squeaking over the snow. Natasha and Sonia, holding up their dresses, jumped out quickly. The count got out helped by the footmen, and passing among men and women who were entering and the program sellers, they all three went along the corridor to the first row of boxes. Through the closed doors, the music was already audible. Natasha, your hair, whispered Sonia. An attendant deferentially and quickly slipped before the ladies and opened the door of their box. The music sounded louder, and through the door rows of brightly lit boxes in which ladies sat with bare arms and shoulders, and noisy stalls brilliant with uniforms, glittered before their eyes. A lady entering the next box shot a glance of feminine envy at Natasha. The curtain had not yet risen, and the overture was being played. Natasha, smoothing her gown, went in with Sonia and sat down, scanning the brilliant tiers of boxes opposite. A sensation she had not experienced for a long time, that of hundreds of eyes looking at her bare arms and neck, suddenly affected her both agreeably and disagreeably, and called up a whole crowd of memories, desires, and emotions associated with that feeling. The two remarkably pretty girls, Natasha and Sonia, with Count Rostov, who had not been seen in Moscow for a long time, attracted general attention. Moreover, everybody knew vaguely of Natasha's engagement to Prince Andrew, and knew that the Rostovs had lived in the country ever since, and all looked with curiosity at a fiancé who was making one of the best matches in Russia. Natasha's looks, as everyone told her, had improved in the country, and that evening, thanks to her agitation, she was particularly pretty. She struck those who saw her by her fullness of life and beauty, combined with her indifference to everything about her. Her black eyes looked at the crowd without seeking anyone, and her delicate arm, bare to above the elbow, lay on the velvet edge of the box, while, evidently unconsciously, she opened and closed her hand in time to the music, crumpling her program. "Look, there's Alenina," said Sonia, "with her mother, isn't it?" "Dear me, Michael Kirillovich has grown still stouter," remarked the count. "Look at our Anna Mikhailovna, what a headdress she has on. The Karagins, Julie, and Boris with them. One can see at once that they are engaged. Drubetskoy has proposed." "Oh yes, I heard it today," said Shinshin, coming into the Rostovs' box. Natasha looked in the direction in which her father's eyes were turned and saw Julie sitting beside her mother with a happy look on her face and a string of pearls round her thick red neck, which Natasha knew was covered with powder. Behind them, wearing a smile and leaning over with an ear to Julie's mouth, was Boris, handsome, smoothly brushed head. He looked at the Rostovs from under his brows and said something, smiling, to his betrothed. "They are talking about us, about me and him," thought Natasha. "And he no doubt is calming her jealousy of me. They needn't trouble themselves. If only they knew how little I am concerned about any of them." Behind them sat Anna Mikhailovna, wearing a green headdress and with a happy look of resignation to the will of God on her face. Their box was pervaded by that atmosphere of an affianced couple which Natasha knew so well and liked so much. She turned away and suddenly remembered all that had been so humiliating in her morning's visit. What right has he not to wish to receive me into his family? Oh, better not think of it, not till he comes back, she told herself, and began looking at the faces, some strange and some familiar, in the stalls. In the front, in the very center, leaning back against the orchestra rail, stood Dolokhov in a Persian dress, his curly hair brushed up into a huge shock. He stood in full view of the audience, well aware that he was attracting everyone's attention, yet as much at ease as though he were in his own room. Around him thronged Moscow's most brilliant young men, whom he evidently dominated. The Count, laughing, nudged the blushing Sonia and pointed to her former adorer. "Do you recognize him?" said he. "And where has he sprung from?" he asked, turning to Shinshin. "Didn't he vanish somewhere?" "He did," replied Shinshin. "He was in the Caucasus and ran away from there. They say he has been acting as minister to some ruling prince in Persia, where he killed the Shah's brother. Now all the Moscow ladies are mad about him. It's Dolokhov the Persian that does it. We never hear a word, but Dolokhov is mentioned. They swear by him, they offer him to you as they would a dish of choice sterlet. Dolokhov and Anatole Kuragin have turned all our ladies' heads. A tall, beautiful woman with a mass of plaited hair and much exposed plump white shoulders and neck, round which she wore a double string of large pearls, entered the adjoining box rustling her heavy silk dress and took a long time settling into her place. Natasha involuntarily gazed at that neck, those shoulders, and pearls and coiffure, and admired the beauty of the shoulders and the pearls. While Natasha was fixing her gaze on her, for the second time the lady looked round, and, meeting the Count's eyes, nodded to him and smiled. She was the Countess Bezikova, Pierre's wife, and the Count, who knew everyone in society, leaned over and spoke to her. "Have you been here long, Countess?" he inquired. I'll call to kiss your hand. I'm here on business, and have brought my girls with me. They say Semenova acts marvelously. Count Pierre never used to forget us. Is he here?" "Yes, he meant to look in," answered Helene, and glanced attentively at Natasha. Count Rostov resumed his seat. "Handsome, isn't she?" he whispered to Natasha. "Wonderful," answered Natasha. "She's a woman one could easily fall in love with." Just then the last chords of the overture were heard, and the conductor tapped with his stick. Some latecomers took their seats in the stalls, and the curtain rose. As soon as it rose, everyone in the boxes and stalls became silent, and all the men, old and young, in uniform and evening dress, and all the women with gems on their bare flesh, turned their whole attention with eager curiosity to the stage. Natasha, too, began to look at it. Chapter 9. The floor of the stage consisted of smooth boards. At the sides was some painted cardboard representing trees, and at the back was a cloth stretched over boards. In the center of the stage sat some girls in red bodices and white skirts. One very fat girl in a white silk dress sat apart on a low bench, to the back of which a piece of green cardboard was glued. They all sang something. When they had finished their song, the girl in white went up to the prompter's box, and a man with tight silk trousers over his stout legs, and holding a plume and a dagger, went up to her and began singing, waving his arms about. First the man in the tight trousers sang alone, then she sang, then they both paused while the orchestra played, and the man fingered the hand of the girl in white, obviously awaiting the beat to start singing with her. They sang together, and everyone in the theater began clapping and shouting, while the man and woman on the stage, who represented lovers, began smiling, spreading out their arms and bowing. After her life in the country, and in her present serious mood, All this seemed grotesque and amazing to Natasha. She could not follow the opera nor even listen to the music. She saw only the painted cardboard and the queerly dressed men and women who moved, spoke, and sang so strangely in that brilliant light. She knew what it was all meant to represent, but it was so pretentiously false and unnatural that she first felt ashamed for the actors and then amused at them. She looked at the faces of the audience, seeking in them the same sense of ridicule and perplexity she herself experienced, but they all seemed attentive to what was happening on the stage and expressed delight which to Natasha seemed feigned. I suppose it has to be like this, she thought. She kept looking round in turn at the rows of pomaded heads in the stalls and then at the semi-nude women in the boxes, especially at Helene in the next box, who, apparently quite unclothed, sat with a quiet, tranquil smile, not taking her eyes off the stage. And feeling the bright light that flooded the whole place and the warm air heated by the crowd, Natasha little by little began to pass into a state of intoxication she had not experienced for a long while. She did not realize who and where she was, nor what was going on before her. As she looked and thought, the strangest fancies unexpectedly and disconnectedly passed through her mind. The idea occurred to her of jumping onto the edge of the box and singing the aria the actress was singing. Then she wished to touch with her fan an old gentleman sitting not far from her, then to lean over to Helene and tickle her. At a moment when all was quiet before the commencement of a song, a door leading to the stalls on the side nearest the Rostovs' box creaked, and the steps of a belated arrival were heard. "There's Kuragin," whispered Shinshin. Countess Bezikova turned smiling to the newcomer, and Natasha, following the direction of that look, saw an exceptionally handsome adjutant approaching their box with a self-assured yet courteous bearing. This was Anatole Kuragin, whom she had seen and noticed long ago at the ball in Petersburg. He was now in an adjutant's uniform with one epaulet and a shoulder knot. He moved with a restrained swagger, which would have been ridiculous had he not been so good-looking, and had his handsome face not worn such an expression of good-humored complacency and gaiety. Though the performance was proceeding, he walked deliberately down the carpeted gangway, his sword and spurs slightly jingling, and his handsome, perfumed head held high. Having looked at Natasha, he approached his sister, laid his well-gloved hand on the edge of her box, nodded to her, and leaning forward asked a question, with a motion toward Natasha. "Mais charmante," said he, evidently referring to Natasha, who did not exactly hear his words but understood them from the movement of his lips. Then he took his place in the first row of the stalls and sat down beside Dólokhov, nudging with his elbow in a friendly and offhand way that Dólokhov whom others treated so fawningly. He winked at him gaily, smiled, and rested his foot against the orchestra screen. "How like the brother is to the sister," remarked the count. "And how handsome they both are." Shinshin, lowering his voice, began to tell the count of some intrigue of Kuragin's in Moscow, and Natasha tried to overhear it just because he had said she was charmante. The first act was over. In the stalls, everyone began moving about, going out and coming in. Boris came to the Rostovs' box, received their congratulations very simply, and raising his eyebrows with an absent-minded smile, conveyed to Natasha and Sonia his fiancé's invitation to her wedding, and went away. Natasha, with a gay, coquettish smile, talked to him, and congratulated on his approaching wedding that same Boris with whom she had formerly been in love. In the state of intoxication she was in, everything seemed simple and natural. The scantily clad Helene smiled at everyone in the same way, and Natasha gave Boris a similar smile. Helene's box was filled and surrounded from the stalls by the most distinguished and intellectual men, who seemed to vie with one another in their wish to let everyone see that they knew her. During the whole of that entr'acte, Kuragin stood with Dólokhov in front of the orchestra partition, looking at the Rostovs' box. Natasha knew he was talking about her, and this afforded her pleasure. She even turned so that he should see her profile in what she thought was its most becoming aspect. Before the beginning of the second act, Pierre appeared in the stalls. The Rostovs had not seen him since their arrival. His face looked sad, and he had grown still stouter since Natasha last saw him. He passed up to the front rows, not noticing anyone. Anatole went up to him and began speaking to him, looking at and indicating the Rostov's box. On seeing Natasha, Pierre grew animated, and, hastily passing between the rows, came toward their box. When he got there, he leaned on his elbows and, smiling, talked to her for a long time. While conversing with Pierre, Natasha heard a man's voice in Countess Bezichova's box, and something told her it was Kuragin. She turned and their eyes met. Almost smiling, he gazed straight into her eyes with such an enraptured, caressing look that it seemed strange to be so near him, to look at him like that, to be so sure he admired her, and not to be acquainted with him. In the second act, there was scenery representing tombstones. There was a round hole in the canvas to represent the moon. Shades were raised over the footlights, and from horns and contrabass came deep notes, while many people appeared from right and left wearing black cloaks and holding things like daggers in their hands. They began waving their arms. Then some other people ran in and began dragging away the maiden who had been in white and was now in light blue. They did not drag her away at once, but sang with her for a long time and then at last dragged her off. And behind the scenes, something metallic was struck 3 times, and everyone knelt down and sang a prayer. All these things were repeatedly interrupted by the enthusiastic shouts of the audience. During this act, every time, Natasha looked toward the stalls, she saw Anatole Kuragin with an arm thrown across the back of his chair, staring at her. She was pleased to see that he was captivated by her, and it did not occur to her that there was anything wrong in it. When the second act was over, Countess Bezichova rose, turned to the Rostov's box, her whole bosom completely exposed, beckoned the old count with a gloved finger, and paying no attention to those who had entered her box, began talking to him with an amiable smile. "Do make me acquainted with your charming daughters," said she. "The whole town is singing their praises, and I don't even know them." Natasha rose and curtsied to the splendid countess. She was so pleased by praise from this brilliant beauty that she blushed with pleasure. "I want to become a Muscovite too now," said Helene. "How is it you're not ashamed to bury such pearls in the country?" Countess Bezichova quite deserved her reputation of being a fascinating woman. She could say what she did not think, especially what was flattering, quite simply and naturally. "Dear Count, you must let me look after your daughters. Though I am not staying here long this time, nor are you, I will try to amuse them. I have already heard much of you in Petersburg and wanted to get to know you," said she to Natasha with her stereotyped and lovely smile. "I had heard about you from my page, Drubetskoy. Have you heard he is getting married? And also from my husband's friend Bolkonsky, Prince Andrew Bolkonsky." She went on with special emphasis, implying that she knew of his relation to Natasha. To get better acquainted, she asked that one of the young ladies should come into her box for the rest of the performance, and Natasha moved over to it. The scene of the third act represented a palace in which many candles were burning and pictures of knights, with short beards hung on the walls. In the middle stood what were probably a king and a queen. The king waved his right arm and, evidently nervous, sang something badly and sat down on a crimson throne. The maiden, who had been first in white and then in light blue, now wore only a smock and stood beside the throne with her hair down. She sang something mournfully, addressing the queen, but the king waved his arm severely, and men and women with bare legs came in from both sides and began dancing all together. Then the violins played very shrilly and merrily, and one of the women with thick bare legs and thin arms, separating from the others, went behind the wings, adjusted her bodice, returned to the middle of the stage, and began jumping and striking one foot rapidly against the other. In the stalls, everyone clapped and shouted bravo. Then one of the men went into a corner of the stage. The cymbals and horns in the orchestra struck up more loudly, and this man with bare legs jumped very high and waved his feet about very rapidly. He was Duport, who received 60,000 rubles a year for this art. Everybody in the stalls, boxes, and galleries began clapping and shouting with all their might, and the man stopped and began smiling and bowing to all sides. Then other men and women danced with bare legs. Then the king again shouted to the sound of music, and they all began singing. But suddenly a storm came on, chromatic scales and diminished sevenths were heard in the orchestra. Everyone ran off, again dragging one of their number away, and the curtain dropped. Once more there was a terrible noise and clatter among the audience, and with rapturous faces everyone began shouting, "Duport! Duport! Duport!" Natasha no longer thought this strange. She looked about with pleasure, smiling joyfully. "Isn't Duport delightful?" Helene asked her. "Oh yes," replied Natasha. Chapter 10. During the entr'acte, a whiff of cold air came into Helene's box. The door opened, and Anatole entered, stooping and trying not to brush against anyone. "Let me introduce my brother to you," said Helene, her eyes shifting uneasily from Natasha to Anatole. Natasha turned her pretty little head toward the elegant young officer and smiled at him over her bare shoulder. Anatole, who was as handsome at close quarters as at a distance, sat down beside her and told her he had long wished to have this happiness, ever since the Narishkins' ball in fact, at which he had had the well-remembered pleasure of seeing her. Kuragin was much more sensible and simple with women than among men. He talked boldly and naturally, and Natasha was strangely and agreeably struck by the fact that there was nothing formidable in this man about whom there was so much talk, but that on the contrary his smile was most naive, cheerful, and good-natured. Kuragin asked her opinion of the performance, and told her how, at a previous performance, Semenova had fallen down on the stage. "And do you know, Countess," he said, suddenly addressing her as an old, familiar acquaintance, "we are getting up a costume tournament. You ought to take part in it. It will be great fun. We shall all meet at the Kuragins. Please come." "No." "Really, said he. While saying this, he never removed his smiling eyes from her face, her neck, and her bare arms. Natasha knew, for certain, that he was enraptured by her. This pleased her, yet his presence made her feel constrained and oppressed. When she was not looking at him, she felt that he was looking at her shoulders, and she involuntarily caught his eye so that he should look into hers rather than this. But looking into his eyes, she was frightened, realizing that there was not that barrier of modesty she had always felt between herself and other men. She did not know how it was that, within 5 minutes, she had come to feel herself terribly near to this man. When she turned away, she feared he might seize her from behind by her bare arm and kiss her on the neck. They spoke of most ordinary things, yet she felt that they were closer to one another than she had ever been to any man. Natasha kept turning to Helene and to her father as if asking what it all meant, but Helene was engaged in conversation with a general and did not answer her look, and her father's eyes said nothing but what they always said, "Having a good time." "Well, I'm glad of it." During one of these moments of awkward silence, when Anatole's prominent eyes were gazing calmly and fixedly at her, Natasha, to break the silence, asked him how he liked Moscow. She asked the question and blushed. She felt all the time that by talking to him, she was doing something improper. Anatole smiled as though to encourage her. "At first I did not like it much, because what makes a town pleasant see sont les jolies femmes? Isn't that so? But now I like it very much indeed," he said, looking at her significantly. "You'll come to the costume tournament, Countess. Do come," and putting out his hand to her bouquet and dropping his voice, he added, "You will be the prettiest there. Do come, dear Countess, and give me this flower as a pledge." "Are the pretty women?" Natasha did not understand what he was saying any more than he did himself, but she felt that his incomprehensible words had an improper intention. She did not know what to say, and turned away as if she had not heard his remark. But as soon as she had turned away, she felt that he was there, behind, so close behind her. How is he now? Confused. Angry. Ought I to put it right? She asked herself, and she could not refrain from turning round. She looked straight into his eyes, and his nearness, self-assurance, and the good-natured tenderness of his smile vanquished her. She smiled just as he was doing, gazing straight into his eyes. And again, she felt with horror that no barrier lay between him and her. The curtain rose again. Anatole left the box, serene and gay. Natasha went back to her father in the other box, now quite submissive to the world she found herself in. All that was going on before her now seemed quite natural, but on the other hand, all her previous thoughts of her betrothed, of Princess Mary, or of life in the country did not once recur to her mind, and were as if belonging to a remote past. In the fourth act, there was some sort of devil who sang waving his arm about, till the boards were withdrawn from under him and he disappeared down below. That was the only part of the fourth act that Natasha saw. She felt agitated and tormented, and the cause of this was Kuragin, whom she could not help watching. As they were leaving the theater, Anatole came up to them, called their carriage, and helped them in. As he was putting Natasha in, he pressed her arm above the elbow. Agitated and flushed, she turned round. He was looking at her with glittering eyes, smiling tenderly. Only after she had reached home was Natasha able clearly to think over what had happened to her, and suddenly remembering Prince Andrew, she was horrified, and at tea, to which all had sat down after the opera, she gave a loud exclamation, flushed, and ran out of the room. "Oh God! I am lost," she said to herself. "How could I let him?" She sat for a long time hiding her flushed face in her hands, trying to realize what had happened to her, but was unable either to understand what had happened or what she felt. Everything seemed dark, obscure, and terrible. There in that enormous, illuminated theater where the bare-legged Duport, in a tinsel-decorated jacket, jumped about to the music on wet boards, and young girls and old men, and the nearly naked Helene with her proud, calm smile, rapturously cried, "Bravo!" There, in the presence of that Helene, it had all seemed clear and simple. But now, alone by herself, it was incomprehensible. What is it? What was that terror I felt of him? What is this gnawing of conscience I am feeling now? She thought. Only to the old countess at night in bed could Natasha have told all she was feeling. She knew that Sonia, with her severe and simple views, would either not understand it at all or would be horrified at such a confession. So Natasha tried to solve what was torturing her by herself. "Am I spoiled for Andrew's love or not?" she asked herself, and with soothing irony replied, "What a fool I am to ask that. What did happen to me? Nothing. I have done nothing. I didn't lead him on at all. Nobody will know, and I shall never see him again," she told herself. "So it is plain that nothing has happened, and there is nothing to repent of, and Andrew can love me still. But why still? Oh God, why isn't he here?" Natasha quieted herself for a moment, but again some instinct told her that though all this was true, and though nothing had happened, yet the former purity of her love for Prince Andrew had perished. And again, in imagination, she went over her whole conversation with Kuragin, and again saw the face, gestures, and tender smile of that bold, handsome man when he pressed her arm. Chapter 11. Anatole Kuragin was staying in Moscow because his father had sent him away from Petersburg, where he had been spending 20,000 rubles a year in cash, besides running up debts for as much more, which his creditors demanded from his father. His father announced to him that he would now pay half his debts for the last time, but only on condition that he went to Moscow as adjutant to the commander-in-chief, a post his father had procured for him, and would at last try to make a good match there. He indicated to him Princess Mary and Julie Karagina. Anatole consented and went to Moscow, where he put up at Pierre's house. Pierre received him unwillingly at first, but got used to him after a while, sometimes even accompanied him on his carousals, and gave him money under the guise of loans. As Shinshin had remarked, from the time of his arrival, Anatole had turned the heads of the Moscow ladies, especially by the fact that he slighted them and plainly preferred the gypsy girls and French actresses, with the chief of whom, Mademoiselle George, he was said to be on intimate relations. He had never missed a carousal at Danilov's or other Moscow revelers, drank whole nights through, outvying everyone else, and was at all the balls and parties of the best society. There was talk of his intrigues with some of the ladies, and he flirted with a few of them at the balls. But he did not run after the unmarried girls, especially the rich heiresses who were most of them plain. There was a special reason for this, as he had got married 2 years before, a fact known only to his most intimate friends. At that time, while with his regiment in Poland, a Polish landowner of small means had forced him to marry his daughter. Anatole had very soon abandoned his wife, and, for a payment which he agreed to send to his father-in-law, had arranged to be free to pass himself off as a bachelor. Anatole was always content with his position, with himself, and with others. He was instinctively and thoroughly convinced that it was impossible for him to live otherwise than as he did, and that he had never in his life done anything base. He was incapable of considering how his actions might affect others, or what the consequences of this or that action of his might be. He was convinced that, as a duck is so made that it must live in water, so God had made him such that he must spend 30,000 rubles a year and always occupy a prominent position in society. He believed this so firmly that others, looking at him, were persuaded of it too, and did not refuse him either a leading place in society or money, which he borrowed from anyone and everyone, and evidently would not repay. He was not a gambler, at any rate he did not care about winning. He was not vain. He did not mind what people thought of him. Still less could he be accused of ambition. More than once he had vexed his father by spoiling his own career, and he laughed at distinctions of all kinds. He was not mean, and did not refuse anyone who asked of him. All he cared about was gaiety and women, and as according to his ideas there was nothing dishonorable in these tastes, and he was incapable of considering what the gratification of his tastes entailed for others, he honestly considered himself irreproachable, sincerely despised rogues and bad people, and with a tranquil conscience carried his head high. Rakes, those male Magdalenes, have a secret feeling of innocence similar to that which female Magdalenes have, based on the same hope of forgiveness. All will be forgiven her, for she loved much, and all will be forgiven him, for he enjoyed much. Dólokhov, who had reappeared that year in Moscow after his exile and his Persian adventures, and was leading a life of luxury, gambling, and dissipation, associated with his old Petersburg comrade Kuragin and made use of him for his own ends. Anatole was sincerely fond of Dólokhov for his cleverness and audacity. Dólokhov, who needed Anatole Kuragin's name, position, and connections as a bait to draw rich young men into his gambling set, made use of him and amused himself at his expense without letting the other feel it. Apart from the advantage he derived from Anatole, the very process of dominating another's will was in itself a pleasure, a habit, and a necessity to Dólokhov. Natasha had made a strong impression on Kuragin. At supper after the opera he described to Dólokhov with the air of a connoisseur the attractions of her arms, shoulders, feet, and hair, and expressed his intention of making love to her. Anatole had no notion, and was incapable of considering what might come of such love-making, as he never had any notion of the outcome of any of his actions. "She's first-rate, my dear fellow, but not for us," replied Dólokhov. "I will tell my sister to ask her to dinner," said Anatole. You'd better wait till she's married." "You know, I adore little girls, they lose their heads at once," pursued Anatole. "You've been caught once already by a little girl," said Dólokhov, who knew of Kuragin's marriage. "Take care." "Well, that can't happen twice." Said Anatole with a good-humored laugh.